The letter arrived on a Wednesday, tucked between bills and flyers I'd usually ignore. My name was scrawled in familiar handwriting, a neat, looping script I hadn't seen in years. I stood on my porch, staring at it, my heart pounding. It was from Rachel. Rachel and I had been inseparable once, as close as two people could be. She was the one who convinced me to take risks, to sneak out past curfew, to dream beyond the borders of our small town. And then, just before senior year, she disappeared. One night she was there, laughing and telling me stories, and the next she was gone. Her parents moved within the month, leaving no forwarding address, no clues as to where she'd gone. I must have spent months replaying our last conversation, wondering if I'd missed something, some hidden message or cry for help. But as time passed, I let her drift into the background, a ghost lingering on the edges of my life. But now here was a letter. I tore it open, my hands trembling, and read the first line. If you're reading this, then I'm finally ready to tell you why I left. I sank onto the porch step, my heart racing. The letter was long, pages of tightly written words, as if she'd been holding this in for years and couldn't stop once she started. She wrote about things I'd never known, about her family, how her parents had been falling apart for years, about the night she left, when her mother packed up their belongings in a frenzy, insisting they had to go, that they had no choice. She'd tried to reach out, she said, but her mother had cut off all her connections, and by the time she was able to write, she worried it was too late, that I'd have moved on. The last page held an invitation. I'm back in town for a little while. If you want to meet, I'll be at the old park on Saturday at sunset. I sat there, holding the letter, feeling a surge of emotions I hadn't let myself feel in years. Anger, sadness, relief. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my pocket, and took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past settle around me. Saturday came quicker than I expected. I spent the day restless, pacing, my mind spinning with questions. By the time the sun was beginning to set, I was on my way to the park, my stomach churning with nerves. The park was exactly as I remembered it, a quiet place with overgrown paths and a small pond ringed by weeping willows. I spotted her sitting on one of the benches, her back to me, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders just like it used to. I took a shaky breath and walked over, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. She turned as I approached, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, caught between the past and the present. She looked different. Older, of course, her face sharper, her eyes a little more guarded. But there was something familiar in her expression, a softness that made my chest ache. "Hey," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She smiled, a small, tentative smile, and I felt a flicker of the old warmth. "Hey!" I sat down beside her, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. We watched the sunset, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the park. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure I'd come either," I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the pond. "I know I hurt you. Leaving like that, it was never what I wanted, but I didn't have a choice. My mom, she needed to go, and I was too young to stay behind. I tried to find you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I looked everywhere, tried to reach out, but it was like you'd vanished." She looked down, her fingers twisting together. "I know. I wanted to tell you, to explain, but by the time I could, I thought maybe you'd moved on, that you'd forgotten about me." I shook my head, my voice thick. "I never forgot, Rachel." We sat there, the silence stretching out as the sky darkened, and slowly, the old memories began to surface. We talked about those days we'd spend in this park, sneaking out in the middle of the night, lying under the stars and making plans for a future we'd never quite reached. It was strange, sharing those memories with her now, knowing all the years that had passed, the lives we'd lived in the time since. After a while, she looked at me, her gaze soft but searching. "Do you think we could be friends again?" I hesitated, the weight of her question settling over me. "I don't know," I admitted, the words raw. "So much has happened. We're not the same people we were." She nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. I know. I guess. I just wanted to try. There was something in her voice, a quiet vulnerability that tugged at me. I looked at her, at the girl who had once been my closest friend, the person I'd trusted with everything, and I felt a strange, tentative hope. Maybe we can start with coffee, I said, my voice soft. Her face lit up, that old spark I remembered flickering in her eyes. I'd like that. We sat there until the stars appeared, talking about nothing and everything, letting the past slip away with each word. The hurt was still there, lingering, but it felt different now, softer, as if time had smoothed its edges. When we finally stood to leave, she turned to me, her expression hopeful, almost shy. I'm glad you came, Mia. I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Me too. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't known I'd been carrying had finally lifted. Maybe we couldn't go back, couldn't undo the years that had passed. But as I drove away, I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet peace, a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. In my sophomore year, we had this wild spring carnival organized by the student council. It was usually tame, face painting, cotton candy, maybe a dunk tank if they were feeling brave. But this year, they tried to up the stakes by adding a petting zoo, which was in hindsight a massive mistake. Everything was going fine until about halfway through the day when someone left the gate to the petting zoo open. I don't know if it was on purpose or just one of those accidents that every high school seems to have, but either way, chaos erupted. First, a goat wandered out, trotting right into the middle of the game booths, nosing at a giant stack of prizes. A couple of students tried to steer it back, but the goat clearly had other ideas. It suddenly bolted for the food stalls, zeroing in on a cotton candy stand like it was the Holy Grail. Then, as if on cue, the rest of the animals decided they'd had enough of captivity. A group of ducks and chickens flapped their way out of the gate, scattering like some bizarre feathered army. The whole carnival turned into this unexpected animal parade, with students and teachers trying to round up the escapees. But the real MVP was the alpaca. It trotted out of the petting area with this majestic, slow-motion attitude like it was royalty, making a beeline straight for the dunk tank. Now, you have to understand, the dunk tank was the big highlight of the day because our principal, Mr. Jacobs, had reluctantly agreed to sit in it if we raised enough money. So there he was, perched above the water in his ridiculous Hawaiian shirt, trying to look brave as students took turns tossing balls at the target. Just as someone finally hit the bullseye, and Mr. Jacobs dropped into the water with a huge splash, the alpaca, with impeccable timing, trotted right up to the dunk tank and stuck its head into the water, drinking and utterly ignoring Mr. Jacobs, who was now soaked and flailing around trying to get out. The crowd was losing it, kids screaming, laughing, teachers scrambling around like it was some farm-themed apocalypse. But the alpaca wasn't done. It lifted its head, looked around as if surveying its kingdom, then spat a giant mouthful of water directly at Mr. Jacobs, who was still trying to climb out. The look on his face was priceless, somewhere between absolute horror and resignation. Even the teachers trying to get control of the situation were cracking up. Finally, the janitor, Mr. Beale, who was this grumpy old guy nobody ever saw smile, showed up with a bucket of feed and started leading the animals back to the petting zoo, grumbling the whole way. The alpaca followed him like an obedient puppy, as if the whole thing had been a carefully planned act of rebellion. By the end of the day, they closed down the petting zoo for safety reasons, but that carnival went down in school history. The picture of Mr. Jacobs drenched and glaring at the alpaca made it into the yearbook with the caption, "Reign of the Alpaca King." Every time I think about it, I still laugh, picturing that alpaca calmly asserting its dominance over our entire high school in one legendary afternoon. It was one of those suffocatingly hot July nights, and my best friend Matt had convinced me to come with him to his family's lake house for a weekend getaway. We've been going there every summer since high school, spending lazy days on the water and nights around a bonfire, talking about our dreams for the future. This time, though, was different. Matt's dad had recently left, and his mom, Linda, had taken it hard. She'd always been the kind of mom who kept things together, managing the family with a quiet strength. But now there was something broken in her eyes. The first night there, Matt went to bed early, and it was just me and Linda sitting out on the back porch, the lake a silent expanse in front of us. We didn't talk much. I could sense that she was lost in her thoughts, sipping her wine and staring off into the darkness. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just sat with her, letting the quiet settle in around us. After a while, she looked over at me with a tired smile and said, "Thank you for being here. It's been a rough few months." I told her I was happy to be there and that I'd always considered her family. She gave me this long look, her eyes lingering just a little too long, and then we fell back into silence. I chalked it up to the wine and the late hour, but there was a tension in the air that was hard to ignore. I made an excuse about needing sleep and headed to bed, hoping a good night's rest would shake off the weird feeling. The next day was all sunshine and laughter on the lake, just me and Matt fishing and joking like nothing had changed. Linda joined us for lunch, and things felt normal again, until later that night. Matt went into town with some old friends, leaving me alone at the house. I was on the porch again, enjoying the quiet, when Linda came out and sat beside me. She was holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, and she poured me a drink without a word. She started talking about the divorce, about how it felt like her whole life had been turned upside down. She was raw and open in a way I'd never seen, and I found myself drawn in, wanting to comfort her. I put my hand on her shoulder, meaning it as a friendly gesture, but she turned to me, her eyes glassy with tears, and leaned into me. One thing led to another, and before I could even think, we were kissing. I knew it was wrong. Every part of me was screaming that I was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop. We moved inside, careful and quiet, like we were doing something dangerous and thrilling. In the morning, I woke up in the guest room, my head pounding with regret. I kept telling myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment. But the look she gave me over breakfast told me otherwise. Over the next few weeks, we started texting, and it quickly became more than just friendly check-ins. When Matt invited me back to the lake house a month later, I knew it was a terrible idea, but I couldn't stay away. Linda and I kept finding moments alone, stolen glances across the room, subtle touches when Matt wasn't looking. The secrecy only fueled the intensity. It all came crashing down one weekend when Matt borrowed my phone to order food. He saw a text from his mom pop up, a message that left no room for misinterpretation. His face went pale as he handed me the phone, his expression a mix of anger and betrayal. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me in shock. Then he exploded, yelling about trust, about how I'd gone behind his back, about how I was supposed to be like a brother to him. I tried to apologize, to explain, but there was nothing I could say that would make it right. He stormed out, and Linda and I just stood there, the weight of what we'd done crashing down around us. She was crying, and I felt this overwhelming guilt, knowing I'd ruined something that could never be fixed. Matt and I haven't spoken since. I lost my best friend, and Linda and I stopped whatever it was we were doing. Now, whenever I see a lake or even just hear someone mention a cabin, my stomach twists with the memory of that summer. A summer that changed everything, and not in any way I'm proud. I was 21, back in my hometown after college graduation, just killing time before my job started in the fall. My old high school buddies and I still hung out, crashing at each other's houses or meeting up at the local bar. One of those friends, Kyle, had always been like a brother to me. His mom, Rachel, had watched me grow up, and her house was almost like a second home to all of us. She'd been through a tough divorce, and Kyle joked about how she was living her best life now, trying new things, dating, even taking up yoga. One weekend, Kyle invited me and a couple of friends over for a bonfire in his backyard. It was one of those humid, starlit summer nights, everyone a little too buzzed, laughing loud enough to wake the neighborhood. Kyle went off with his girlfriend, and the others headed home, leaving just me and Rachel sitting by the dying fire, talking about everything and nothing. She poured herself a glass of wine and offered me one, which felt oddly adult. We laughed about how long it had been since high school and how much everything had changed. She talked about the divorce, how tough it had been to start over in her 40s, how sometimes she felt out of place in her own life. There was a strange vulnerability in her voice, and I felt this urge to comfort her. She reached over and placed her hand on my arm, a small, soft touch, and suddenly I was hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of her hand, her perfume, the way the firelight flickered over her face. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and electric. Before I knew it, she leaned in and kissed me, softly at first, like she was testing the waters. I knew it was a line I shouldn't cross, but in that moment, reason took a backseat. One thing led to another, and we ended up in her bedroom. The night felt like a fever dream, thrilling and surreal. But when I woke up the next morning, reality hit hard. I slipped out of her room quietly, feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line I couldn't uncross. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing, a weird fluke. But a few days later, she texted me, saying she enjoyed talking with me and asking if I wanted to come by for coffee. I knew what she meant, and against every ounce of better judgment, I went. We started meeting up regularly, both of us pretending it was casual, but it never felt that way. I was lying to Kyle every time I saw him, dodging questions, making excuses, knowing he'd never forgive me if he found out. The guilt started eating at me. Every time I saw Kyle, I wanted to tell him, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Then one night, Kyle saw my car parked outside his mom's house when I wasn't supposed to be there. He texted me, asking what was up, and I froze, unsure of what to say. I tried to brush it off, but he didn't buy it. The next day, he confronted me, and I could see the betrayal in his eyes as he pieced it together. He didn't yell or punch me like I half expected. He just looked at me with this quiet hurt, said, "I thought you were my friend," and walked away. That was the last time we spoke. Kyle cut me off completely, and Rachel ended things too. I was left with this hollow ache, knowing I'd lost my best friend and destroyed the bond I'd had with his family. To this day, whenever I go back home, I avoid their street entirely, because seeing that house just reminds me of what I threw away in one reckless summer. I convinced myself that working as a massage therapist at a high-end spa would be simple, calming even. I was fresh out of certification and eager to start something new, thinking that I'd spend my days surrounded by peaceful music, the scent of eucalyptus, and grateful clients. But nothing really prepares you for those first days when you're the new kid, trying to navigate this strange, sometimes absurd world of intimate but professional contact. The spa was nestled in the quiet part of downtown, hidden behind a lush, manicured garden and housed in an old brick building with creaky wooden floors. My supervisor, Carla, was an intense, no-nonsense woman who had been working there for nearly 2 decades. She had a way of looking you in the eyes that made you want to stand a little straighter. "The clients come first," she told me with absolute certainty. "Make them feel special, but always keep your boundaries." Some of them push those boundaries. I nodded, thinking I understood, but I soon realized she'd been trying to warn me in her own way. My first client was a businessman in his 50s, graying hair, sharp suit, and eyes that darted around the room like he was looking for something. I led him to the massage table, instructing him to undress to his comfort level. When I came back, he was lying face down under the sheet, his shoulders visibly tense. As I started the session, I could feel his muscles slowly soften under my hands. About halfway through, he sighed and said, "I haven't relaxed in weeks." It was an unexpectedly tender admission, and for a moment, it felt like I was doing more than just easing physical tension. I was helping him unwind the stress he wore like armor. But then came the second client, and any illusions I had about the job were quickly shattered. This man, probably in his early 40s, started making requests as soon as I walked in, first about the music, then the temperature of the room, and then, as I started the massage, about focusing more on his inner thighs. I kept my composure, tried to steer the session back to a neutral, professional place, but he kept pushing, hinting that he wanted something extra. My heart was pounding, and I felt my hands tense up, but I took a deep breath, gave him a firm, rehearsed line about professional boundaries, and redirected the session. He grumbled, but eventually he quieted down, leaving me both relieved and shaken by the end. In the staff room after, I told Carla about the experience, expecting a sympathetic ear. She just gave a wry smile and said, "Welcome to the job, honey." Then she handed me a cup of tea and told me it gets easier. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I nodded, appreciating the tea and her no-nonsense comfort. Then came the third client of the day, a regular named Joyce. Joyce was in her late 60s, with wild curls and a warmth that immediately filled the room. She walked in with a big smile, telling me she was looking forward to our session all week. She settled onto the table, humming to the music, and as I began the massage, she started telling me about her garden, her cats, and her grandkids. With Joyce, I felt none of the nerves or awkwardness, just a steady, comfortable rhythm. She chatted the whole time, and by the end of the session, she was practically glowing. As she was leaving, she pressed a small tip in my hand, saying, "You have a good energy, dear. You're going to be wonderful here." That little gesture was exactly what I needed. It was like she knew how rattled I'd been, how uncertain I felt. As the day wound down, I found myself looking back on each client with a new understanding. This job wasn't just about muscles and technique. It was about reading people, creating a space for them, understanding when to listen and when to hold firm boundaries. I wasn't just a pair of hands. I was part of an experience they carried with them. That first day ended with me walking home in the cool night air, exhausted but also strangely grounded. I knew the days ahead wouldn't be easy, that I'd face more challenges and more awkward situations. But I also knew I'd found a role that stretched me, that made me feel like I was doing something meaningful in ways I hadn't expected. As I walked, I felt a quiet pride settle over me, realizing I was ready for whatever the next day brought. Sometimes, the things that change your life most are the ones you never saw coming. For me, it was a dusty old backpack I found shoved into the corner of my closet one Saturday morning. It was one of those days when I decided to finally get organized. I'd been promising myself I'd sort through my stuff for years, but of course, life kept getting in the way. I was about halfway through emptying my closet when I found it. An old, weathered backpack, still caked with dust from years of sitting forgotten. Curious, I unzipped it, not even remembering what I'd stuffed in there all those years ago. Inside, I found a mess of random items, a pocket knife, a half-used notebook, an ancient map folded 100 times over. I started flipping through the notebook, and that's when the memories came flooding back. The last time I'd used that backpack, I'd been in college, backpacking through Europe with a group of friends on a shoestring budget. We'd been idealistic, unstoppable, convinced we'd see every corner of the continent with nothing but rail passes and cheap hostels. For a moment, I could almost hear the sounds of the bustling city squares, feel the chill of the early morning air as we'd waited for the first train to wherever we'd decided to go next. But life happened. Graduation, jobs, relationships, and that adventurous part of me had slowly faded away. As I held that old map in my hands, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my boss, reminding me about a last-minute deadline for a project I'd been dreading. I felt a pang of something, a feeling I couldn't quite name, restlessness maybe, or regret. All I knew was that I didn't want to spend another weekend glued to my screen, obsessing over yet another project that would lead to yet another promotion I didn't actually want. I glanced back at the backpack, at the memories of a different me, a version that felt buried under years of routine and predictability. Without thinking much about it, I packed the backpack with a few essentials, threw on my coat, and drove out of the city. I didn't have a plan, only a vague memory of a trail I'd hiked once, years ago, that overlooked a nearby lake. I wanted to see if it still felt the same, or if I could even find it. It took about an hour to drive there. The parking lot was almost empty, and a light mist clung to the trees. I slung the old backpack over my shoulder, suddenly filled with a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in ages. The trail was overgrown but still passable, winding up through thick woods and along rocky paths. As I climbed, I felt my mind quieting, like I was shedding layers of stress and expectations with every step. Halfway up, I found an overlook where the whole valley stretched out below, blanketed in fog. I sat there for a long time, feeling that same thrill of awe I'd felt on my travels years before. It was like I was reconnecting with a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. After an hour or so, I pulled out the notebook, curious to see what I'd written back then. Inside, I found a list titled, "Things to Do Before 30." I laughed, flipping through it. Half of the items were ridiculous things like climb a mountain and learn to surf. things I'd never even come close to doing. But some of them were simpler: spend a night under the stars, try something completely new every month, write something meaningful. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done any of those things. Somewhere along the way, I'd traded that curiosity and spontaneity for routine, stability, and comfort. I didn't regret the life I'd built, but I realized, sitting there with that old list in my hands, that I missed the person I'd once been. On a whim, I took a pen and added a new item to the list: take a leap of faith. I didn't know what it meant or how I'd do it, but it felt important to write it down. I spent most of that weekend on the trail, exploring, camping out under the stars just like I'd promised myself I would. When I finally got back home, I felt different. Lighter, maybe, like a part of me had woken up. That Monday, I showed up to work and immediately felt the weight of the office walls closing in on me. I opened my inbox to a flood of emails, deadlines, and meetings, and all I could think was, I don't want to do this anymore. I didn't want my life to be reduced to back-to-back meetings and endless projects that only made someone else's dreams come true. By the end of the day, I'd made a decision. I went into my boss's office, took a deep breath, and handed him my resignation. He looked stunned, of course. I'd been there for nearly a decade, climbing the ladder, the model employee. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was time for a change. Over the next few weeks, I started putting plans in place, saving up, downsizing, letting go of the things I didn't need. I didn't have an exact plan, only a vague idea that I wanted to travel, to explore, to see if I could rekindle that sense of wonder and adventure that had once been so much a part of me. I ended up spending the next year traveling through places I'd never thought I'd see. Places I'd dreamed of back in college, but never thought I'd actually visit. I slept under stars in the Australian outback, hiked through remote mountain villages in Nepal, wandered through markets in Morocco, and camped out in Iceland. I filled that old notebook with stories, sketches, fragments of conversations I overheard, and lists of things I wanted to remember forever. Every moment felt like a gift, like I was reclaiming pieces of myself that I'd forgotten. It wasn't always easy. There were lonely days when I questioned everything, when I missed the comfort of home and the familiarity of routine. But those moments were outweighed by the countless experiences that reminded me of why I'd taken this leap. Eventually, I came back home, but everything was different now. I started freelancing, doing work that actually felt meaningful, and carving out time to pursue my own projects. I spent more time outdoors, reconnecting with nature, finding beauty in the simplest things. I learned to let go of the need for everything to be planned and perfect. And every now and then, I open that old notebook and look at that list. Most of the items are checked off now, some in ways I never could have expected. But one item remains unchecked: take a leap of faith. Because in a way, that item never really gets checked off. It's the one that reminds me to keep moving forward, to keep taking risks, to keep exploring the unknown. It's funny how life sometimes gives you exactly what you need, hidden in the most ordinary things. A forgotten backpack, a dusty notebook, a list of dreams from a younger, braver version of yourself. I look back now and realize that all along, the person I was searching for was still there, just waiting for me to remember her. Sometimes it only takes one small choice to change everything. And sometimes the leap you're most afraid to take is the one that will bring you back to yourself. In my freshman year, our high school had this bizarre tradition where every winter, right before break, each class would compete in a snow day event, a weird mix of games, challenges, and absolutely unhinged attempts at team spirit. Freshmen were generally ignored, so we figured we didn't stand a chance. But one of our classmates, Sam, had other ideas. Sam was the guy who always took things way too seriously, and for him, this was some sort of calling. The week before the event, Sam showed up to school with blueprints. Actual blueprints he'd drawn up for a snowman that could, as he put it, stun the whole school into silence. His plan was to make an enormous snowman, big enough to dwarf any snowman the seniors might attempt, by rolling as much snow as possible into giant boulders and stacking them up like a snow fortress. We all laughed it off, but Sam was dead serious. He rallied a group of us, and we spent lunch breaks strategizing, even drawing up shifts to keep rolling snowballs through the night so they'd freeze solid by morning. It was ridiculous, but the sheer insanity of it won us over. The night before snow day, a bunch of us snuck out after curfew and met in the field by the school. We were freezing, our gloves soaked through, but Sam was like a drill sergeant, keeping us rolling these massive balls of snow under the moonlight. It took hours, but by dawn, we'd built a monstrous snowman, at least 12 feet tall, complete with a scarf made from someone's old gym shirt, a nose crafted from an orange traffic cone, and eyes made of huge rocks. Sam added one final touch, a spray-painted sign that read Class of 2024 Rules stuck on the chest. When the rest of the students arrived, the entire freshman class was huddled around the snowman like it was some kind of holy relic. The seniors tried to build their own, but when they saw ours, they just groaned and gave up. Teachers were equal parts amused and horrified. Mr. Watkins, the art teacher, even took photos and said he'd hang them in his classroom as a tribute to creativity and unnecessary levels of effort. But the best part? Our snowman made it onto the local news. A reporter was covering the snow day festivities, and when she saw the massive snowman towering over the field, she couldn't resist. The story ran with the headline, "Freshman Class Creates Record-Breaking Snowman," a symbol of school spirit or shenanigans. Sam was thrilled. He said it was his crowning achievement and walked around the rest of the day like a local celebrity. That snowman stood proudly for 2 weeks, even after the rest of the snow melted away, like some surreal monument. It was just a pile of slush and rocks by the time we got back from winter break, but every freshman from that year still remembers it as the time we took down the seniors, and Sam became a legend. I'll never forget that first night as an overnight operator for a 24-hour hotline that was part support, part intimate conversation, and part, well, improvisation. I've been searching for any side gig to make ends meet, and a late-night job in a call center seemed perfect. The training had been brief. I'd been given a thick manual with scripts, but it wasn't long before they admitted the reality. You'll need to adapt on the fly. In other words, the manual wouldn't be much help. When I sat down at my cubicle, the room was nearly empty, except for a few other rookies who looked just as terrified as I felt. We were given headsets, a dim lamp, and privacy screens on our computers. My supervisor, a cheerful woman named Rita who had a voice like melted caramel, looked at us over her reading glasses and said, "Remember, you're here to help." The voice they hear on the line might be the only one they hear tonight. The first call I got was a gentle introduction, a woman in her 60s who'd wanted someone to talk to while she couldn't sleep. She told me about her dog, her late husband, and the summer flowers she missed seeing in bloom. It felt like I was just keeping her company, a soft-voiced stranger helping her feel less alone. By the end, she was thanking me, saying she felt calmer. I thought, if they're all like this, maybe I really can handle it. Then came the second call. The guy on the other end wasted no time. "I want you to help me with something special," he breathed into the phone, his voice low and intense. I froze, unsure of how to respond, my mind scrambling to remember any of the advice from training. But I'd barely had time to process before he started going into explicit details. Every nerve in my body screamed to hang up, but I heard Rita's advice echoing in my head. Stay professional, stay calm. I steadied my voice and did what I could, but when he finally hung up, I was left staring at my screen, feeling rattled, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over me. The calls that followed were a blur of random, unpredictable encounters. I spoke with a man who said he just wanted to feel appreciated and spent nearly an hour asking me to compliment him, which somehow felt both awkward and oddly vulnerable. Then there was a young woman who called asking for advice about her upcoming wedding, confessing her doubts about her fiancé, as though I were her therapist. The most surprising calls were the ones where people were just looking for comfort, reassurance, a kind voice. Some were silly, some intense, but most were human, looking for any connection they could find. Then near the end of my shift, I got the call that stayed with me. The line clicked, and a young-sounding guy, probably in his 20s, said a quiet hello. He told me he couldn't sleep and that he felt alone in a new city, far from home. As we talked, he admitted that he'd moved for a job he wasn't sure he even wanted, and he'd left behind friends, family, everyone who knew him. He said he'd called on impulse, not really expecting anyone to answer, and his voice cracked a bit when he thanked me for picking up. Something in his tone broke through my carefully guarded professionalism. I could feel the weight of his words, the loneliness. I started asking questions, drawing him out, and he slowly opened up, telling me about his favorite memories from home, the little things he missed most. We laughed about his stories, and I told him about some of my own adventures, keeping my voice light. By the end, he was thanking me over and over, saying he felt like he'd just spent an evening with an old friend. And when he finally hung up, I just sat there, staring at the phone, feeling something profound and unshakable. That night, I walked out of the call center as the sun was rising, my head still swimming from the whirlwind of voices, stories, and confessions. I'd gone into the job thinking it would be just another paycheck, something simple and straightforward. But by the end, I realized that it was far more than that. It was a reminder that, even in the strangest of circumstances, a single voice can make someone feel less alone. That first night gave me a new perspective on people, on connection, and on the quiet power of simply listening when someone needs to be heard. The decision to leave my phone behind for a weekend was admittedly a bit out of character. I'd been glued to that little rectangle for years, my lifeline to work, friends, family, and just about everything else in my life. But it had started to feel like it was slowly consuming me. The constant pings, notifications, the pressure to keep up with everyone and everything. So, when a friend suggested a solo cabin trip without any tech, I decided to try it, just as an experiment. I rented a small cabin on a secluded lake about 2 hours from the city. It was the kind of place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the calls of distant birds. I loaded up on books, journals, and groceries, and set off that Friday evening, leaving my phone in my kitchen drawer. Just stepping out the door, without it felt strange, almost reckless, but there was a thrill to it too. A break from the world, even if just for a couple of days. The cabin was perfect in its simplicity. A small living room, a cozy kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a little dock that led straight out onto the lake. That first night, I built a fire, cooked a quiet meal, and sat outside under a vast, clear sky filled with stars. I'd forgotten how rich silence could feel, how it seemed to stretch around me like a blanket. I went to bed early, feeling calmer than I had in months. The next morning, I woke with the sun. Without my phone to scroll through, I poured myself a cup of coffee and took it out onto the dock, breathing in the cool morning air. The lake was still, perfectly mirroring the trees and sky. It was the kind of scene that demanded nothing but quiet appreciation, so I just sat there, letting the stillness settle over me. Around mid-morning, I decided to go for a hike along one of the trails that wound around the lake. The path was narrow and winding, leading me deeper into the forest. After about an hour, I reached a clearing where I found an old, weathered bench overlooking the lake from a high vantage point. The view was breathtaking, and I felt a pang of gratitude for having come here, away from the constant noise of my usual life. As I sat there, something caught my eye. Carved into the wood of the bench, in faded letters, were the words, "What will you remember when you're old?" It struck me as such a simple but profound question. Sitting there, I thought about all the things I'd spent my life chasing, the deadlines, the promotions, the endless emails. I'd been so focused on moving forward, on getting ahead, that I'd barely stopped to notice the moments that actually made me feel alive. The question stayed with me all day, echoing in my mind as I wandered back to the cabin. By that evening, I found myself picking up an old journal I'd brought along, intending to jot down a few thoughts. But once I started writing, I couldn't stop. I wrote about moments I'd almost forgotten, small but vivid memories that filled me with a quiet happiness. I wrote about summer nights spent with friends, road trips to nowhere, the time I'd hike through a rainstorm just to see a waterfall. None of these moments had been big achievements. They were simple, fleeting experiences, but they held a kind of magic that I hadn't felt in years. The second night was colder, so I lit a fire and wrapped myself in a blanket. I read until my eyes grew heavy, and as I drifted off, I felt this deep, aching sense of clarity, as if the noise of my daily life had finally quieted enough for me to hear something important. On Sunday morning, I went for a final walk along the lake, savoring the last few hours of solitude. I knew that as soon as I returned to the city, Life would pull me back into its familiar rhythms, the demands and expectations creeping in again. But something had shifted in me. I had an urge to protect this quiet, reflective part of myself, to nurture it somehow, even in the middle of my busy life. When I finally packed up the cabin and drove back home, I felt like I was returning with something precious, something fragile that I didn't want to lose. I walked through my front door, and there, sitting on the kitchen counter, was my phone exactly where I'd left it. The screen was filled with notifications, texts, emails, updates. It buzzed impatiently, pulling me back to the world I'd left behind. I almost didn't turn it on. For a long moment, I just stood there, holding it in my hand, debating whether to take another day, maybe even another week before diving back in. But I sighed, knowing I couldn't delay the inevitable, and powered it up. As the messages loaded, I scrolled through them with a strange detachment. I noticed how few of them actually mattered, how much of it was noise. I realized that the life I wanted to remember, the moments worth keeping, weren't waiting for me in those notifications. In the weeks that followed, I made some changes. I started setting boundaries, keeping my phone off in the evenings, carving out space for things I'd let slide. I spent more time outdoors, reconnected with old hobbies, even started taking weekend trips on my own. I learned how to say no to things that didn't align with what I truly valued, no matter how small or mundane. I went back to that question on the bench many times. What will you remember when you're old? Each time, it reminded me that life isn't about ticking boxes or keeping up with 100 little demands. It's about being present, fully alive, soaking in the details of each day. It's about carving out time for the things that bring you joy, letting go of the rest, and holding on to those fleeting moments that make you feel like yourself. And now, every so often, I leave my phone at home and take a walk down to a nearby park or to a coffee shop just to be alone with my thoughts. Sometimes I sit there and do nothing at all, just watching the world move around me. I don't know if anyone else feels it, that deep pull to step away, to listen to the silence beneath the noise. But I think maybe they do, because I've seen others sitting alone, staring out at nothing, like they're lost in some memory only they can see. That weekend at the cabin reminded me of a truth I think we all know deep down but forget in the rush of daily life. That sometimes the things worth holding on to aren't things at all, but the quiet moments that reconnect us to ourselves. And I've learned to cherish those moments, to seek them out, because when all is said and done, I think those will be the memories I hold closest. The simple, silent ones that remind me of who I am and who I want to be. My friend Anna has this story from when she worked as a night manager at a high-end hotel that's like a mix between a comedy and a thriller. The hotel prided itself on providing 5-star service to its guests, which often meant bending over backward to fulfill ridiculous requests at all hours. And, as Anna says, you never know what a guest will ask for at 2 a.m. One night, Anna was doing her rounds when she got a call from the front desk. A guest in the penthouse suite needed immediate assistance, which usually meant they wanted extra towels or room service. But as soon as she answered, the guest, a regular named Mr. Evans, an eccentric millionaire who stayed at the hotel every few months, whispered, "I need you to come up, but come quietly, and bring gloves." Anna's curiosity piqued. She grabbed a pair of latex gloves from the housekeeping cart and took the elevator up, wondering what on earth she was getting herself into. When she arrived, Mr. Evans cracked open the door just enough to peek out. He looked stressed, even a little panicked. He motioned her in without a word, and as she entered, she saw his penthouse was in complete disarray. Towels and pillows were scattered everywhere, and the minibar was half empty. But that wasn't the strangest part. There, in the center of the living room, was an enormous taxidermy owl, a very expensive one, by the look of it, lying on its side with one of its glassy eyes missing. Anna raised an eyebrow, trying to process what she was looking at. Mr. Evans, without any explanation, pointed to the owl and said, "I need this fixed before sunrise." Anna blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. He went on to explain, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that he had promised an associate he'd deliver the owl intact the next morning. Apparently, it was some rare antique that he was supposed to bring to a business deal, and he'd somehow lost track of it during his stay. She held back a laugh and said, "Sir, I'm not sure what you want me to do with a broken owl at 3 in the morning." But Mr. Evans was desperate. He offered her an insane amount of money just to get the owl fixed up enough to pass inspection. Anna had never done anything like this before, but the payout was too good to refuse. She quickly Googled taxidermy repair and, miraculously, found a 24-hour craft store nearby. She drove over, bought some glass beads, a needle, and glue, and returned to the hotel, where she set to work. She had no idea what she was doing, but she figured no one would notice in the dim lighting. For an hour, she painstakingly glued a bead into the empty socket, then used a bit of makeup from her own bag to give the owl a natural look. Finally, as dawn broke, she stepped back to survey her work. It was passable if you squinted. Mr. Evans was overjoyed, tipping her lavishly and promising to recommend her for a raise. Anna left feeling like she'd just been part of the strangest heist in history. The next morning, she half expected him to complain, but he checked out without a word. She assumed he'd pulled off his owl-centered business deal. After that night, Anna's co-workers called her the Owl Whisperer, and to this day, anytime she hears about someone needing a last-minute fix, she just shakes her head and says, "As long as it's not a taxidermy emergency, we're fine." It was a rainy Sunday, and I found myself wandering through a used bookstore downtown, the kind of place where the shelves are stacked so high you can barely see the tops. I was hidden in a corner, flipping through a worn-out novel, when I felt someone bump into me from behind. "Oops, sorry about that." A guy my age, looking a bit flustered, grinned apologetically. He had wild curls escaping from under a knit beanie and a stack of books balanced precariously in his arms. "No problem," I replied, smiling. "Seems like you've got a small library there." He laughed, glancing at the mountain of books in his arms. "Guilty. It's a bad habit. I tell myself I'll just look, but then," he shrugged. "I mean, who can resist the smell of old paper and existential crises?" I chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Oh, totally. I came in just for some light reading," I said, gesturing to the 700-page novel in my hands. "Looks like we're both hopeless." He looked at my book, raising an eyebrow. "Tolstoy? Okay, you're hardcore. Only on rainy Sundays," I replied, trying not to blush. He shifted his stack of books and pointed to an armchair nearby. "Look, I was going to pretend to read for a while to avoid the rain. Care to join?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes hopeful. I hesitated, but something about his easygoing manner made me feel at ease. "All right, but don't judge if I fall asleep mid-Tolstoy." We settled into armchairs across from each other, surrounded by towers of books. For a while, we both read in silence. The only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft patter of rain on the window. It was strangely intimate, sharing a quiet space with a stranger who seemed content to just be there. After a few chapters, he set his books down and looked over at me. "So, what's your verdict on Tolstoy so far?" I pretended to consider it seriously. "Well, I've made it through about 15 pages, and so far, I'd say it's dense." He laughed, nodding. "That sounds like Tolstoy, all right. Maybe I should have warned you with something lighter, like Wuthering Heights or Ulysses." "Oh, you mean bedtime stories?" I shot back, and we both burst out laughing, earning a look from the elderly bookstore owner who shushed us, looking mildly amused herself. We spent the next hour talking about our favorite books, the ones we couldn't finish, and the ones we'd read over and over. He told me about his job at a nonprofit and how he'd originally wanted to be a travel writer, but somehow ended up staying in the city. I told him about my collection of postcards from places I'd never been, and he promised to send me one from every city he ever visited. At some point, he glanced outside and sighed. "Well, looks like the rain's finally letting up." He looked almost disappointed. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a pang of reluctance myself. I'd nearly forgotten about the world outside those shelves. He picked up his books, hesitating. This was fun. I don't usually strike up conversations in bookstores, but I'm glad I did. He smiled, a little bashful. "Do you think I could see you again? Maybe in another corner of the bookstore?" I smiled back, handing him my phone. "How about coffee? With or without Tolstoy?" He typed in his number, grinning as he handed it back. "I'll bring a lighter book next time. Maybe something without existential dread." As I watched him leave, his armful of books swaying dangerously, I couldn't help but feel like I'd just walked out of the opening chapter of a story. In senior year, we had this eccentric new biology teacher, Mr. Grant, who genuinely believed that experiential learning was the way to go. He was the kind of guy who'd drag us outside to identify plants in the freezing cold or bring in squirming creatures just to show the beauty of nature. We didn't take him seriously at first, but as the year went on, we realized he was serious about making biology unforgettable, and he didn't care if it meant bending a few rules. So, naturally, when we learned we'd be dissecting frogs, we braced ourselves for something extra. The day of the dissection, Mr. Grant started class by dramatically wheeling in a massive tank covered in a tarp. The entire class went silent, wondering if he'd gone overboard yet again. He gave us his trademark grin, pulled off the tarp, and revealed live frogs. Not just any frogs, either. These were enormous, muscular bullfrogs that looked like they'd been training for the Olympics. He announced, "Before you can dissect a frog, you have to understand a living one." We spent the first 15 minutes in chaos, trying to bond with our frogs as he insisted. There were girls shrieking, frogs leaping out of our hands, and Mr. Grant cheerfully offering advice like, "Just let it feel your energy." But the real mayhem started when one of the frogs broke free. It leapt out of my friend Sarah's hands, sprang off the table, and landed smack in the middle of the classroom floor. We tried to grab it, but before we could blink, 2 more frogs had broken loose, hopping all over the room like some demented nature documentary. In the chaos, Mr. Grant just laughed, insisting, "This is part of the experience." But then, as if on cue, one of the escapees managed to hop right into the hallway. The rest of us looked at each other, wide-eyed, until Mr. Grant yelled, "After it! Go, go, go!" We tore into the hall, running down the frog and trying not to attract too much attention. But it was too late. A crowd of underclassmen gathered, watching us scramble after frogs with a mix of fascination and horror. We managed to catch 2 of them, but the third had already made it down to the main office, where it leapt onto the secretary's desk and nearly gave her a heart attack. Finally, the principal, Mr. Thompson, showed up just as we captured the last escapee. He crossed his arms and gave us that someone better explain, "Look," but Mr. Grant just shrugged, grinned, and said sometimes biology has a mind of its own. I thought for sure we were in trouble, but Mr. Thompson just sighed, shook his head, and walked away muttering, "Only at this school." Back in class, Mr. Grant gave us a completely unbothered nod and said, "All right, everyone, now that you've really met your frogs, let's get back to the lesson." By this point, our respect for him had hit an all-time high. We may not have learned the parts of a frog's anatomy perfectly that day, but no one could deny that Mr. Grant knew how to make biology unforgettable. The story of the Great Frog Escape was told and retold all year, and whenever we saw him in the hallway, he'd just give us a knowing wink as if we were all part of his private little science experiment. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend trip with friends to celebrate a birthday. My buddy Jake had invited a group of us to his family's cabin for his 25th, the perfect excuse to leave behind our routine lives and unwind by the lake. Jake's mom, Eva, was staying there too, which wasn't unusual. She'd always been a part of our lives, the cool mom who'd look out for us, make sure we were safe, but let us have our fun. She was easygoing, confident, and had a way of making everyone feel comfortable. The first night, after hours of drinking, eating, and catching up, everyone drifted off to bed, one by one. I wasn't quite ready to turn in, so I stayed up by the fire pit, watching the flames flicker and enjoying the quiet. Eva came out to join me, wrapped in a sweater, carrying 2 mugs of warm tea. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, smiling in that way that made you feel like you could tell her anything. We started talking about the usual things, work, life, Jake's adventures, but eventually she shifted the conversation to herself. She opened up about how lonely it had been since her divorce, how strange it felt to be single after so many years of marriage. I could tell she was holding back tears, but she laughed them off, shaking her head. "Listen to me," she said, pouring my heart out to you, of all people. I reached over, touched her hand lightly, telling her she could always talk to me. For a second, we just looked at each other, and something unspoken passed between us. I should have pulled back, but instead, I found myself leaning in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She didn't move away. The air felt heavy, and the world around us went still. We kissed, tentatively at first, but then we were holding on to each other, as if making up for years of loneliness in one single moment. It felt surreal, wrong, and exhilarating at once. When I finally pulled back, reality hit me like a wave, and I muttered something about needing to get some air, disappearing into the night. I barely slept that night, lying awake, replaying what had happened and feeling a rush of guilt. The next morning, everything felt strained, though no one else seemed to notice. Eva and I avoided each other's eyes, trying to pretend nothing had happened. But later, when everyone else went out for a hike, we found ourselves alone again in the cabin. The tension was palpable, and despite every ounce of logic in me, we picked up right where we'd left off. Over the next few weeks, we started seeing each other in secret. She'd text me after Jake and I hung out, and I'd find excuses to drop by her place whenever I could. It was reckless and messy, but I couldn't stay away. She felt like a breath of fresh air, someone who understood me in ways I hadn't expected. But all the while, the guilt gnawed at me, knowing Jake would never forgive me if he found out. The breaking point came one night when I accidentally left my phone at Jake's place. He must have seen her name pop up on my lock screen with a message that was a little too friendly. By the time I came back for my phone, he had pieced it together. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, hurt and rage in his eyes. "Are you serious?" he finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words, but he cut me off. "You're dead to me," he said, and the finality of it hit me harder than any punch could have. I felt a sinking pit in my stomach, knowing I'd shattered the one friendship that had been like family to me. Eva tried to reach out afterward, saying she talked to Jake, that maybe things would blow over in time. But I knew there was no fixing it. I ended things with her that night, too ashamed to keep going, and left town soon after, putting miles between me and the mess I'd made. Now, whenever I think about that cabin, it's with a sense of loss. A reminder of a friendship and a connection that I'll never get back, all because of one line I should never have crossed. This is the story of how a single text message changed my life. It was an average Tuesday night. I was lounging on my couch, scrolling through the usual social media feeds while the TV murmured in the background. My phone buzzed, and without much thought, I glanced down. It was a text from an unknown number. "Long time no see. Let's catch up tomorrow at 4. Same place?" I stared at it, confused. Same place? I didn't recognize the number, but I figured it was a wrong text. I was about to ignore it, but something made me hesitate. I was curious. I typed back, "I think you have the wrong number." Almost immediately, another text came through. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you've forgotten already." I couldn't help but laugh. Whoever this was, they were persistent. I replied, "Seriously, I don't know who this is. Are you sure you have the right person?" After a few seconds, the typing bubble appeared, followed by another message. "If you don't show up, you'll never know." I was intrigued now, but it was nearly midnight, so I put my phone down and tried to sleep. But I kept thinking about the text. Who was it? What was the same place? Why did it feel like a dare? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should go, even if it was a prank. I spent most of the afternoon battling with myself, coming up with reasons not to go, but at 3:30, I found myself grabbing my coat, heading out the door. I didn't know where the same place was, but I decided to try a small cafe near my office. It was quiet, with little booze perfect for catching up. It seemed like the kind of place for a mysterious rendezvous. I ordered a coffee and waited. I wasn't even sure who I was waiting for, but at exactly 4 p.m., a woman walked in and scanned the room. She looked about my age, with dark hair pulled back and a scarf wrapped around her neck. I looked at her, wondering if she'd approach, but she gave me a polite nod and walked to a booth in the corner. A few minutes passed, and she looked at me again, this time with a faint smile. I took that as an invitation and walked over. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked awkwardly. She raised an eyebrow, but a spark of recognition flickered in her eyes. "Well, I wasn't, but maybe I should be," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Sit down." So I did. We sat across from each other, sizing each other up in silence. Then she finally spoke. "You came?" "Yeah, I wasn't sure why," I admitted. I got this message from a random number, and I just thought, well, why not? She looked surprised, then laughed. Wait, are you telling me you're not who I texted? We both burst out laughing, realizing what had happened. But instead of ending there, we kept talking. She told me her name was Alex, and that she'd meant to meet an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Somehow, her message had found its way to me, a complete stranger who just happened to be curious enough to follow through. 1 coffee turned into 2, then 3. Hours slipped by as we shared stories, anecdotes from our lives, our dreams, our regrets. I couldn't remember the last time I'd connected with someone so quickly, so effortlessly. We joked about how random it was, how this wasn't supposed to happen, and yet there we were. When the cafe closed, we walked outside together, lingering under the streetlights as if neither of us wanted to leave. She looked at me and smiled, a little shy now. So, do we ever meet here again? She asked, glancing back at the cafe. I took a deep breath. How about next Tuesday? Same time, same place? She laughed, nodding. It's a date. And so, the next Tuesday, we met again. And the Tuesday after that. We kept our standing accidental date, showing up every week like clockwork. We never missed a week, not even when it rained. Not even when she was swamped with work or I had a brutal week. Each time we met, we'd talk about everything and nothing, slipping further and further into each other's lives. It was like we'd both been handed a piece we hadn't realized was missing. After a few months, one of our usual Tuesday nights took a different turn. We had just finished dinner and were walking along the river when she stopped and looked out over the water. You ever think about fate? She asked softly. I nodded. Sometimes, but I think it's more about what we do with the chances we get. She turned to me, and in that quiet, unassuming moment, I realized I loved her. I didn't say it out loud then. I didn't have to. There was an unspoken understanding between us that everything had changed. Our Tuesday dates became Thursday dinners, then weekend adventures. Eventually, we started talking about a future together, a home, maybe even a family. That text message had been the beginning of everything, the spark that had lit a fire I didn't know I needed. One day, a few years later, we were packing up our first apartment together, and I came across my old phone, long since retired to the bottom of a box. I charged it up out of curiosity, and there still saved in my messages was that first mysterious text. I showed it to Alex, laughing. Can you believe this was how it all started? She smiled, tracing her finger over the screen. If you hadn't answered, we might never have met. I shook my head, marveling at how close I'd come to ignoring it. I almost didn't, but something told me to go. She took my hand, squeezing it gently. I'm glad you did. We stood there for a moment, caught up in the memory of that random, fateful Tuesday, and I felt a wave of gratitude so strong it left me speechless. It had all started with a wrong number, a twist of chance that led me straight to her. Now, every so often, I think about the strange, unpredictable paths life takes us on, the small choices that ripple outward in ways we can't begin to understand. A random text message, a stranger's smile in a cafe, a choice to say yes instead of no. If you told me years ago that my life would change because of a single text from a wrong number, I would have laughed. But that's the funny thing about life. You never really know which moment, which choice, will end up being the one that changes everything. And sometimes, all it takes is one small, unexpected message to show you exactly where you're meant to be. I hadn't thought much about what my first night as a late-shift hotel concierge would be like. The job listing had made it sound routine, mostly answering phones, dealing with reservations, giving the occasional restaurant recommendation. But this was a 5-star hotel downtown, the kind of place where celebrities and CEOs stay, where the demands could be as intense as the clientele. My first shift started at midnight, and the lobby was almost empty, echoing with soft piano music and the low hum of the lights. The manager on duty, a calm, older man named Greg, showed me around, going over the basics and pointing out all the little details I'd need to know. He barely looked fazed when he mentioned the regulars, guests who stayed often and apparently had unique requests. You'll get the hang of it, he said with a half smile that didn't exactly fill me with confidence. Around 2 a.m., just when I was starting to feel more comfortable, the first call came in. I picked up, expecting a simple request for extra towels or a late-night snack. Instead, the voice on the other end, a man with a thick southern drawl, asked if I could arrange for 12 pink roses to be delivered to his room by sunrise. I blinked, unsure if he was serious, but he continued, explaining that they needed to be pink, not red, and that they were for someone special. I stammered a response and put him on hold, rushing over to Greg, who just chuckled and handed me a card with the name of an all-night flower shop. "Trust me," he said, "you'll get used to the odd requests." I called the shop, made the arrangement, and by the time the roses were on their way, I felt like I'd already aged a year. Just as I was getting back to my desk, a man came into the lobby, looking completely distraught. He was disheveled, clutching a crumpled paper bag, his eyes darting around the room. He walked up to me, mumbling that he'd locked himself out of his room. I quickly grabbed a new key, but when I handed it to him, he hesitated, looking like he might cry. Then, he started spilling his story, how he'd come to the city to propose to his girlfriend, how she'd said no, and how he'd been wandering around in a daze ever since. I found myself standing there listening to him pour out his heartbreak, feeling like I'd stumbled into a therapy session rather than a concierge shift. After he left, I finally took a breath, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions from just one night. But before I could even settle, the phone rang again. This time, it was one of the hotel's high-profile guests, a famous actress who was staying on the top floor. She needed a specific type of almond milk delivered to her room, immediately. "It's for my skin," she said, like that explained everything. I managed to find some in the hotel's cafe fridge and rushed it up, knocking on her door with a shaking hand. She opened it, barely looked at me, but gave an approving nod before closing the door. Mission accomplished, but my nerves were shot. Around 4 a.m., the lobby was finally quiet, and I was running on pure adrenaline. Just when I thought I might actually survive the shift, a tall, impeccably dressed man walked in, carrying an enormous painting. He was visibly drunk, staggering as he approached the front desk. "Could you keep this safe?" he slurred, propping the painting up against the counter. It was a massive, framed landscape of a city skyline, and he looked at me with the most sincere, hopeful expression. I tried to explain that we couldn't exactly store artwork, but he was insistent, saying it was his heart and soul, that it had to be kept somewhere safe. I was too exhausted to argue, so I promised I'd guard it until he returned. He thanked me with the gravitas of someone trusting me with his life and stumbled off to the elevators. The painting sat next to me for the rest of the shift, an absurdly grandiose companion as the sun started to rise outside the lobby windows. When my shift finally ended, I felt like I'd lived an entire year in one night. Greg gave me a nod as I clocked out, a look that said, "Welcome to the club." I walked out into the early morning light, feeling like I'd somehow been part of 100 lives all in the span of a few hours. That first night taught me that in a place like that hotel, you weren't just providing a service. You were the silent keeper of people's secrets, their quirks, their vulnerabilities. I didn't know if I'd last, but I was pretty sure there'd never be a dull moment. I used to think life was a series of choices, each one leading logically to the next, like a path laid out in stone. But all that changed on the night I missed my train. It was a regular Tuesday evening, and I was on my way home from work, caught up in a long chain of texts with my boss about a deadline I'd already given everything to meet. I'd been putting in long hours, chipping away at an ambitious project, the kind that consumes you, until one day you look up and realize you've barely been living outside of it. Exhausted, distracted, I didn't notice my train pulling away until it was gone, leaving me alone on the platform, the city lights casting long shadows around me. With nothing to do but wait for the next train, I wandered through the station, my mind still churning with work worries. That's when I saw it, a small, battered notebook sitting on one of the benches. I'm not sure why I picked it up. It looked like something someone had tossed aside, something that had been forgotten, but there was something about it that felt personal, like it was waiting for someone to find it. I flipped through it, half expecting it to be empty, but it was filled with pages upon pages of notes, sketches, little snippets of someone's life. And what struck me most were the questions scrawled in messy handwriting across every few pages, like little prompts meant for whoever might read them. What do you actually want to do? If you could go anywhere, where would it be? When was the last time you felt truly alive? I couldn't shake the feeling that these questions were somehow meant for me, even though I'd never seen this notebook before. I read through the pages, feeling as if a stranger's words were reaching right into the core of who I was, peeling back layers I'd spent years carefully building. The next train was scheduled to arrive in 10 minutes, but I didn't want to leave. I sat on that cold bench, reading page after page, each one making me think about my life in a way I hadn't in years. There were more notes scattered throughout, snippets of someone's daily observations. Today, I watched the sunset over the river and realized I've been moving too fast. I spoke to a stranger on the bus. I felt more like myself in that 10 minutes than I have in the past 10 years. The words resonated with me deeply, but they also made me feel uneasy. When was the last time I'd taken the time to watch a sunset, to talk to a stranger, to experience anything outside the narrow bubble of my daily routine? My train pulled in, but I didn't get up. I watched it come to a stop, watched the doors open and close, watched it pull away again, disappearing down the tracks. It was like something was holding me back, telling me not to leave, not yet. I flipped to the very back of the notebook, and there, on the last page, was a final question. If you could start over, would you? That one stopped me. Start over? The idea felt surreal, even irresponsible. But there was something liberating about it, too. Like a sliver of possibility had slipped into my life, reminding me that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to make a change. I don't remember leaving the station or walking down the street. But the next thing I knew, I was wandering the neighborhood, looking at the world around me in a way I hadn't in years. The streets were quieter than usual, and I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The glow of the neon signs, the chatter from a nearby cafe, the people walking past me, each one carrying a life I knew nothing about. I felt like a tourist in my own city. Eventually, I found myself at a small, unassuming bar that I'd passed 100 times but had never noticed. Without thinking, I walked in. It was quiet inside, dimly lit, with the faint hum of jazz playing in the background. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a drink, and pulled out the notebook, flipping through the pages again. After a few minutes, the bartender came over, glancing at the notebook in my hand. "Interesting read?" he asked, nodding at it. I smiled, unsure how to explain. I actually found it at the station. Someone just left it there. It's full of questions and notes, like it was meant for someone to find. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Must be a reason you found it then." "Yeah," I murmured, surprised at how much I agreed with him. "It's making me think about things I haven't thought about in a long time." He poured me a refill and nodded. Funny how sometimes the right thing shows up exactly when you need it. "You gonna keep it?" I considered this for a long moment, flipping through the pages one last time. As much as I wanted to, I knew this notebook wasn't mine to keep. It was part of someone else's story, a piece of a journey they'd left behind, maybe for someone like me to find. But I also knew that the questions it had raised, the thoughts it had sparked, were things I needed to hold on to. After I finished my drink, I left the notebook on the bar, thanked the bartender, and walked back out into the night, feeling lighter than I had in years. The next day, I made a decision. I took a week off from work, packed a small bag, and booked a one-way ticket to the coast. I had no concrete plans, just a vague idea of exploring, of letting myself drift for a while. I wanted to see if I could remember what it felt like to live without a checklist, without a schedule. That week was a revelation. I spent my days wandering through unfamiliar streets, hiking trails, sitting on the beach at dawn just to watch the waves roll in. I let myself talk to strangers, let myself linger over meals, let myself breathe. I even started a notebook of my own, filling it with questions, sketches, memories, whatever came to mind. One afternoon, while sitting on a rock overlooking the ocean, I wrote down my own question. What kind of life would you live if no one else was watching? And in that moment, I realized how much of my life I'd been living for others, for the expectations, the approval, the sense of making it. But I hadn't been living for me. When I finally returned home, I knew things had to change. I scaled back on my hours at work, letting go of projects that felt meaningless. I started prioritizing things I actually enjoyed: writing, painting, spending time outdoors. I even began making time each week to sit at a cafe or in a park, just watching the world move around me. The notebook I'd found that night had vanished from my life as mysteriously as it had appeared. But the questions it left me with lingered, guiding me in ways I never could have predicted. Sometimes I wonder who left it, what their story was, if they'd ever realized what a ripple their words would create. And I wonder if somewhere out there, someone else has picked it up, reading those same words and feeling that same spark of possibility. Years have passed since that night, but every now and then I find myself at that station, looking at the bench where I first saw the notebook. I don't wait for trains much anymore, though. These days, I'm too busy writing my own story. Last winter, I took a solo trip to a small coastal town a few hours away, hoping for a change of scenery. I'd been feeling restless, caught in the monotony of my job, and the idea of being by the ocean sounded like exactly what I needed. The town was quiet, mostly empty in the off-season, which was perfect. It felt like I'd stepped into a different world, one that hadn't quite woken up. The first evening there, I went for a walk along the rocky shore. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting everything in that deep, inky blue. As I was wandering, I noticed a small, weathered house perched alone on a cliff, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. It looked like something out of a storybook, its faded wood and tilted roof bearing the weight of years and weather. Curious, I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed a dim light in one of the front windows and, to my surprise, a handwritten sign in the door that read, "The Memory Shop." I almost laughed. It sounded like something out of a dream, but there was something about that name that drew me in, something that felt oddly familiar, though I couldn't place it. I hesitated at the door, not entirely sure if I should go in, but before I could second-guess myself, the door creaked open. An older man, maybe in his 70s, stood there, smiling warmly. He had a kind face, weathered like the house itself, with eyes that seemed to hold entire lifetimes. Come in," he said, gesturing for me to step inside. I don't get visitors too often these days. Inside, the house was filled with shelves upon shelves of trinkets, small objects that looked like they'd each lived a life of their own. There were old-fashioned clocks, faded postcards, chipped teacups, and glass jars filled with sea glass. It was the kind of place where everything seemed to hum with history, as if the air itself was thick with stories. "What is this place?" I asked, glancing around in awe. The man chuckled. "It's exactly what the sign says. A memory shop. People come here to leave something behind, something they can't hold on to anymore." I gave him a puzzled look, but he just motioned for me to follow him to a small, worn table in the corner. On it lay a beautiful, ornate wooden box, polished to a soft shine. "This," he said, tapping the lid gently, "is the heart of the shop. People bring me memories they no longer want, or sometimes ones they're afraid of losing. I keep them safe here." I stared at the box, intrigued. "So, people come here to forget things?" "Not exactly," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "They come here to let go. Memories are funny things, you know? They're not meant to be kept locked away. Sometimes they weigh too much." He paused, giving me a long look. "You look like someone who's been carrying a heavy one. Do you have anything you'd like to leave behind?" I laughed, surprised. "I don't think I brought anything with me." The old man just smiled, as if he'd heard that line before. Everyone has something, even if they don't realize it. I glanced around the shop, taking in the quiet stillness, the way each object seemed to have its own presence. And then, out of nowhere, I felt a pang, an old ache I hadn't thought about in years, one I'd buried deep. It was a memory of my father. My father had passed away when I was young, and I'd spent years trying to keep his memory alive, clinging to little things that reminded me of him. A baseball glove he'd given me, a small collection of pocket watches he'd loved. I realized, standing in that shop, that I'd never really let myself say goodbye. I was holding on to him, but in a way that left me tangled in grief, unable to move forward. The old man seemed to sense it. "You can leave a memory here if you like," he said gently. "It doesn't mean you'll forget him. It just means you'll let him rest." I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. I'd never considered that before, the idea of letting go without losing the love. The man gestured to a small silver locket on a nearby shelf. "Here," he said, picking it up and placing it in my hands. "Hold this and tell him whatever you need to say." I felt a strange calm settle over me as I clasped the locket, as if I were finally ready to do what I'd been putting off for years. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool weight of the locket in my palm. In my mind, I saw my father's face, smiling that familiar, gentle smile. "I love you, Dad. I always will. But it's time I let you go." I took a deep breath, feeling a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. When I opened my eyes, the man was watching me, a soft understanding in his gaze. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling lighter somehow. He took the locket from me and placed it carefully in the box. "Now," he said, "you can carry the memory without the weight." I left the shop that night feeling different, as if something inside me had shifted. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the ache of that old grief, it was still there, but it was softer, gentler, no longer something I had to hold on to so tightly. As I was leaving, I turned back to thank him one last time, but the house seemed empty, dark. The sign on the door was gone. I almost wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I felt a lightness in my chest, a sense of release that was undeniably real. The next morning, as I walked along the shore, I felt like I was seeing everything for the first time. The ocean was brighter, the air crisper, and my mind felt clearer than it had in years. I knew, deep down, that I'd been given a gift, one I couldn't fully explain, but one that had set me free. Since then, I've thought about that old man, about his strange little shop, and I wonder how many people have found their way there, strangers stumbling in with memories too heavy to bear. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, he's still sitting in that quiet house on the cliff, waiting with that gentle smile, ready to help the next person let go. Now, whenever I think of my father, it's with warmth, not pain. And every so often, when life starts to feel too heavy, I close my eyes and imagine that little shop on the cliff, a place where memories live gently, free of the weight of longing. Last spring, I was working late at a small, family-run library where I volunteered a couple nights a week. I loved the quiet, the smell of old books, and the feeling of timelessness that filled the space. It was a sanctuary for me, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach. It was the kind of library where regulars came every week, where every shelf had a story, and where the silence felt like it had its own voice. One night, close to closing, a man walked in. I didn't recognize him. He didn't look like a local, or even like someone passing through town. He had an air of stillness, with a face that seemed unburdened by time. He wore a dark coat, a scarf despite the warm weather, and a serious expression. He seemed as out of place as he was perfectly suited for a place like that. He walked slowly down the aisles, almost like he was searching for something specific. Every so often, he'd stop, reach up, and run his fingers along the spine of a book, only to move on again without pulling it from the shelf. I watched him from the circulation desk, feeling this inexplicable urge to speak to him, but not knowing what to say. Finally, he reached the end of an aisle, paused, and turned to look directly at me. His gaze was calm, intense, like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. "Are you the librarian?" he asked in a low, even tone. I shook my head. "Just a volunteer," I replied, my voice quieter than usual. "But I can help you find something if you're looking for it." He considered this, tilting his head slightly. "I'm looking for a book," he said, "but I'm not sure if it's here. Or anywhere, for that matter. Do you know the title?" "It doesn't have a title," he replied, his eyes holding mine. "And it doesn't belong to any genre. It's a book that's different for everyone who finds it." I blinked, taken aback. "Different how?" He gave a small smile. "It shows you things you've lost." I wasn't sure if he was serious, if he was pulling my leg, or if he was some kind of eccentric wandering the shelves in search of magic. But I felt something stir in me, a curiosity, a pull. I thought of things I'd lost, of questions I hadn't been able to answer, and for a moment, it almost felt possible that a book could hold them. "Would you like help finding it?" I asked, half expecting him to laugh or shrug it off. But instead, he nodded. "Yes, it's in here somewhere. I can feel it." We walked through the aisles together, weaving through the history section, past the faded classics, and down to the fiction shelves. He moved with a kind of purpose, occasionally stopping to look at a book, as if he sensed something just out of reach. I found myself caught up in the search, even though I didn't know what I was looking for. It felt like an adventure, a strange, quiet one, but an adventure all the same. Eventually, he stopped in front of a shelf filled with old journals and diaries. They were dusty, forgotten books that hardly anyone ever looked at. He pulled a small leather-bound journal from the shelf, its cover worn and faded, and handed it to me. I took it, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The cover was unmarked, no title, no author, just a soft, blank surface. I opened it, expecting empty pages, but instead found writing. Handwritten entries, page after page. As I skimmed through the first few lines, my heart started to race. The words on the page felt achingly familiar. The first entry was written in a neat, careful script. March 7th, 2008. Today I walked to the lake with Dad. He told me stories about the stars, about how each one carries a memory of the people who have looked up at them. I wish I could capture all of them, keep them safe somehow. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I knew this memory. It was one of my own, written in a notebook I'd lost years ago, a journal I kept when I was young and too shy to share my thoughts with anyone. I thought it had been gone forever, thrown out or misplaced in some move. But here it was, somehow preserved in this old library, in the hands of a stranger. How did you know? I stammered, looking up at him in disbelief. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me with that calm, knowing expression. I didn't, he said softly. The book knows what it needs to show you. It's different for everyone, remember? I stared down at the pages, flipping through entry after entry, each one a fragment of a younger version of myself, pieces I thought I'd lost. It was surreal, like reading a stranger's life, but feeling every word as if it were my own. There were entries about my childhood friends, notes about the dreams I'd had, memories of my father, the person I'd been, all laid out in this mysterious little book. I closed the journal, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through me. But how did it get here? How did this end up in this library? He smiled, a gentle, mysterious smile that held something timeless. Some things are never truly lost. They just wait for the right moment to be found. I held the journal tightly, feeling both gratitude and disbelief. Thank you, I whispered, though I didn't fully understand what I was thanking him for. He nodded, as if he knew exactly what I meant. Remember, not everything lost is meant to be kept. Some things need to be let go. Others, they find their way back when you're ready. He reached out and gently touched the cover of the journal. And for a moment, I felt a warmth seep into my hands, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Then he turned and began walking toward the door. Wait, I called, wanting to ask him more, to understand. Will I see you again? He paused, looking back at me with a glimmer of kindness in his eyes. Perhaps, he said, but you won't need me the next time. You'll know what you're looking for. With that, he slipped out into the night, leaving me alone in the quiet library with my journal and the memories it held. I stayed there long after he left, reading through the pages, letting myself remember all the pieces of myself I'd thought were gone. When I finally left the library that night, I felt a lightness in my chest, as if I'd been given a second chance to know myself, to hold on to the things that mattered, and to let go of the things that didn't. I've been back to the library many times since then, hoping to see him again, but I never have. The journal sits on my shelf at home, a reminder of that strange, magical night, and the gift he gave me, the gift of myself, returned to me when I was finally ready to remember. Last autumn, I went hiking alone in the mountains near my hometown. I'd recently gone through a rough breakup, and the idea of spending a weekend away, alone and off-grid, felt like the reset I needed. I rented a small cabin at the base of the mountain and packed only the essentials, my journal, some instant coffee, and enough food to get me through a few days. No phone, no laptop, just quiet and nature. The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent hours hiking, breathing in the cool air, watching the leaves turn fiery shades of red and gold. It was so quiet that every sound felt amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of the wind, even the distant call of birds. I could feel my mind clearing, like I was shedding all the noise and static I'd been carrying. That night, I sat outside the cabin with a mug of coffee, watching the stars come out. It was the kind of silence that presses against you, making you aware of every thought and feeling. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about my ex, the plans we'd made, the life I thought we'd build together. It was hard not to feel that old ache, the familiar sting of what if creeping in. Just as I was sinking into those thoughts, I heard a voice, a faint, almost musical sound drifting through the trees. I froze, listening. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, humming a soft, haunting melody. I couldn't make out any words, but the sound was unmistakably human. I stood up, peering into the woods. The sound seemed to be coming from further up the mountain, along one of the trails I hadn't yet explored. It was already dark, but something compelled me to follow it, this strange feeling that I was meant to hear it, like it was calling to me. I grabbed a flashlight, threw on a jacket, and started up the trail, my steps slow and careful. The song grew louder as I climbed, winding through the trees like a whisper, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't question it. It felt oddly natural, as if I were following a thread of memory rather than a stranger's voice. After about 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing and saw her, a woman standing by an old, crumbling stone well. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders. And though she must have heard my approach, she didn't turn around. She just kept humming that melody, her voice weaving through the night. "Hello," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman finally turned to face me, her eyes calm and almost familiar. She looked at me with a small, knowing smile, like she'd been expecting me. "You came," she said, her voice gentle but firm, as if I'd agreed to something without knowing it. Did you call me?" I asked, feeling slightly foolish. She nodded, gesturing for me to come closer. "In a way, yes. Sometimes we hear things when we're ready to listen." I didn't know what that meant, but I felt compelled to step forward. She looked down at the well, running her fingers along its cracked stone edge. "This well," she said almost to herself, "has held secrets for a long, long time. People used to come here to cast away their burdens, their regrets. They'd whisper them into the water, and the well would keep them safe." I stared at her, unsure if this was some kind of ritual or if I was dreaming. "What do you mean? Keep them safe?" She looked at me with a faint smile. "Some memories weigh us down. Sometimes they're things we carry for far too long. Griefs, disappointments, even the loves that didn't work out. They become heavy, don't they?" My chest tightened. I knew exactly what she meant, though I didn't want to admit it. It was like she'd seen through the walls I'd put up, straight to the parts of me I tried to ignore. "Would you like to let something go?" she asked, her voice soft, inviting. I looked down at the well, at the still, dark water that seemed to stretch endlessly below. There was something both unsettling and comforting about it, as if it were offering a chance to release everything I'd been holding on to. Without really thinking, I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness. I spoke of the things I hadn't allowed myself to feel, the lingering pain from the breakup, the unspoken fears about the future, even the guilt I carried over things I couldn't change. As I spoke, I felt the weight of those emotions rising to the surface, spilling over like water overflowing a dam. When I opened my eyes, the woman was watching me, a kind of quiet understanding in her gaze. "There," she said, her voice almost a sigh. "It's done." I felt an odd sense of relief, as if something heavy had lifted, though I couldn't explain why. "Thank you," I murmured, unsure what else to say. She nodded, then took a step back, her figure melting into the shadows. "Remember," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "some things are meant to be let go." And then she was gone, as if she'd never been there. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark water, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. It was as if I'd left a part of myself there, something I didn't need anymore. When I finally made my way back to the cabin, I felt more at peace than I had in months, a quiet acceptance settling over me. The next morning, I went back to the clearing, wanting to see the well in the daylight. But when I arrived, There was nothing there. No clearing, no well, just dense forest. I must have walked back and forth along the trail a dozen times, trying to retrace my steps, but it was as if the place had vanished. I returned to the cabin feeling disoriented, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Had it all been a dream? But I knew, deep down, that it had been real, or real enough. I could feel the difference in myself, the lightness, the strange sense of closure. Whatever I'd left at that well, it was gone, and I didn't need to carry it anymore. I left the mountains later that day, heading back to my life with a new perspective, a quiet strength I hadn't known I was capable of. Since then, whenever I feel that old ache returning, I think of the well, of that quiet clearing that may or may not have ever existed. And in those moments, I let myself believe that maybe, somewhere deep in those woods, the well is still there, waiting to take whatever we're ready to leave behind. And sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that faint, haunting melody, reminding me that some burdens don't need to be carried alone. I hadn't planned on going anywhere that Friday. Work had been brutal, and my bed was calling my name. But then my phone pinged with a text from my friend Tom. New bar just opened. You need to see this place. Come out. He sent a photo of the bar, all sleek lighting and cozy booths, and I couldn't resist. 5 minutes later, I was grabbing my coat and telling myself I'd only stay for an hour. The place was buzzing when I arrived. The air was thick with the scent of citrus and something smoky, and I immediately felt a charge. Tom waved me over, and soon enough, we were at the bar, swapping stories and making each other laugh. But halfway through our second drink, my attention was pulled away by someone who just walked in, a guy who looked like he belonged anywhere but here. He had on a worn leather jacket and jeans, his dark hair messy in a way that looked entirely accidental. He was scanning the room, and when his eyes met mine, I felt an unexpected jolt like I'd been caught off guard. He gave me a nod, a half smile, and for reasons I still don't understand, I smiled back. It wasn't long before he made his way over, introducing himself as Lucas. His voice was warm and rough around the edges, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. We started talking, and there was an ease to it that felt rare, as though we'd skipped past the awkward small talk and gone straight into a deeper rhythm. He asked what I was doing in a place like this, half joking, and I laughed, telling him I could ask him the same thing. As we talked, it became clear that we were both in need of a night that didn't follow a script. He asked if I wanted to grab a drink somewhere quieter, and before I knew it, we were outside, wandering down the empty streets in search of an adventure. It felt reckless and exhilarating, like we were letting the night unfold on its own terms, without any expectations. We ended up at a tiny late-night cafe, tucked away and almost empty, with red leather booths and old posters lining the walls. Over coffee and pancakes, we traded stories that were half-truths and exaggerations, each trying to one-up the other, laughing like we'd known each other for years. He had a way of talking that made everything sound fascinating, and I found myself hanging on to every word. At some point, he reached across the table, brushing his fingers over mine, and the laughter faded into something quieter, heavier. There was a warmth to his touch, a spark that felt like a secret, and I could feel my heart racing in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. When he leaned in, his kiss was soft, slow, and in that moment, the world around us disappeared, leaving only the two of us and the quiet hum of the night. We walked back to his place, our hands brushing as we moved through the empty streets, both of us lost in the simplicity of just being together. His apartment was small and cluttered, with shelves full of books and a record player in the corner. He put on some soft, mellow music, and we sat on the floor, talking in whispers, sharing secrets that felt like pieces of ourselves we didn't usually reveal. The night blurred in a mix of laughter, whispered words, and moments of quiet closeness that felt almost too real. For a few hours, it was like we'd created our own little world, separate from the ordinary lives we'd come from. It felt timeless, like something I'd remember long after the night was over. When I woke up, the first light of dawn was creeping through the blinds, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. Lucas was still asleep, his arm draped over me, his face relaxed in the morning light. I stayed there for a moment, watching him, feeling a strange mix of happiness and melancholy. I knew that this night was something special, something rare, and that part of me didn't want to let it end. But reality has a way of setting in, and as much as I wanted to stay wrapped up in that perfect moment, I knew it was time to go. I slipped out of bed quietly, gathering my things, hoping to leave before I woke him. Just as I reached the door, I heard him stir, his voice sleepy as he called my name. I turned to see him watching me with a soft smile, his eyes a little sad but understanding. "You could stay," he said, his voice quiet, hopeful. For a brief moment, I considered it, letting myself imagine what might happen if I took a chance, if this night could somehow turn into something more. But I gave him a small smile, shook my head, and told him goodbye. The walk home was strange, the city slowly waking up around me as I tried to process everything. I felt both grateful and heartbroken, knowing I just had a night that would stay with me long after it was over. It was a memory that was already starting to feel like a dream, beautiful but fragile, like it would slip away if I tried to hold on to it too tightly. In the days that followed, I kept thinking back to that night, replaying the laughter, the warmth, and the connection we'd shared. It was the kind of experience that left me wanting more, that reminded me of what it felt like to be seen, to connect with someone in a way that went beyond the surface. Since then, I've held that memory close, a reminder of the kind of connection I'm looking for. I know now that as much as I love the thrill of a spontaneous night, I'm searching for something deeper, something that doesn't dissolve with the morning light. I want a connection that can last, that can carry me through the ordinary days as well as the extraordinary nights. And until I find it, I'll carry that night with Lucas as a reminder of what's possible. The kind of magic that can happen when you let yourself be open, when you step into the unknown, even if just for one perfect night. It was late summer, the kind of sweltering August where everyone was just waiting for fall to come and give us a break. My best friend, Danny, and I had known each other since grade school, and his mom, Caroline, was like a second parent to me. She was a single mom, having raised Danny on her own, and she'd always treated me like family, asking about my classes, feeding me whenever I came over, even lending me money once when I was short on rent. One weekend, Danny invited a bunch of us over to celebrate his new job with a barbecue at his place. We ate, laughed, and downed more drinks than we probably should have, and as the night went on, people started to trickle out. Eventually, it was just me, Danny, and Caroline left in the backyard. Danny passed out on one of the lounge chairs, leaving me and his mom to clear the last of the dishes. When we finished, Caroline poured us each another glass of wine, and we sat down on the back porch, watching the stars. She started talking about how proud she was of Danny and how grateful she was to have me around as a good influence on him. I laughed it off, saying he was the one who'd kept me out of trouble more than once. And then we both fell silent, caught in that odd, unspoken tension that had crept up between us. She glanced over, giving me a look I'd never seen before, soft, almost vulnerable. She sighed, taking a long sip of wine before saying, "It's been a long time since I felt like I had someone I could really trust." She looked away, and for a moment I thought she might cry. Without thinking, I reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. She turned toward me, and before I knew it, we were kissing. It felt unreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. Every rational part of me screamed to stop, but we were both caught in the moment, letting years of tension unravel in a few messy, desperate seconds. The next morning, I woke up on their living room couch, head pounding, half convinced it had all been a dream. But Caroline walked in with coffee, a quiet smile on her face, and I knew it had been very real. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a strange lapse in judgment fueled by late-night emotions and too much wine. But later that week, she texted me, asking if I wanted to come by for dinner while Danny was out. I knew it was wrong, but I went anyway. That one-time thing quickly became something we couldn't stop. It was exhilarating, sneaking around, having this secret that no one else knew. But every time I hung out with Danny, the guilt dug in deeper. He was my closest friend, and here I was betraying him in the worst way imaginable. Everything fell apart a month later when Danny came home early from a weekend away and caught us together. I'll never forget the look on his face, the anger, the hurt, the absolute disbelief. He just stood there, his fists clenched, his face red, while Caroline tried to explain. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with betrayal. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking. "I never want to see you again." I tried to call him, to apologize, to make it right somehow, but he blocked me everywhere. Caroline and I stopped talking after that, too. I knew there was no going back. No way to fix what I'd broken. Danny moved out not long after, and I haven't seen or spoken to him since. Now, every time I drive past that house, it feels like a ghost town, just a painful reminder of a friendship I threw away in a moment of weakness. We met in college during orientation, two clueless freshmen in a sea of new faces. I don't know how it happened, but within days, we were practically inseparable, the kind of friends who text each other at all hours, who show up with food during finals, who can just be silent together without it feeling weird. People joked we were like an old married couple, always bickering but attached at the hip. He was my best friend, my closest confidant, the person I could count on for anything. We had an unspoken understanding that this was it, and I was happy with that. Or at least, that's what I told myself. For years, we stayed in each other's lives through heartbreaks and bad jobs, cross-country moves, and late-night calls when things fell apart. I dated other people. He had too, but no relationship ever really came close to what we had. When things went wrong, he was always the one who was there to pick up the pieces. And I convinced myself that's all it was. Just friendship, no lines blurred, no feelings crossed. Then last summer, everything changed. I'd been going through a rough time, dealing with a messy breakup, and he offered to come over and keep me company. I was grateful, even though I felt like a mess. He showed up with my favorite snacks, the worst romantic comedy he could find, and a plan to make me laugh until I forgot all about my ex. We spent hours like that, and somewhere between laughing and crying, he pulled me into a hug. It felt like home. I don't know what happened next. It was like something took over. He looked at me, really looked at me, with an expression I'd never seen before. And then he kissed me. It was soft, tentative, like he was testing the waters. I was so shocked that I didn't move at first, but as his hand slipped to the back of my neck, I found myself kissing him back. Years of buried feelings, of pretending we were just friends, suddenly burst out, and it felt like everything made sense. The next morning was surreal. We both woke up in a tangle of sheets, a mix of excitement and confusion between us. For a second, everything felt perfect, but then the reality of what we'd done hit us, and a heavy silence filled the room. I didn't know what to say, and he looked as lost as I felt. We muttered awkward goodbyes, promising to talk about it later, but later didn't come. In the days that followed, things got weird. We tried to pretend nothing had happened, but every time we saw each other, there was this tension, this unspoken question hanging between us. I found myself second-guessing every text, every laugh, every little gesture, wondering if he was feeling the same confusion and longing that I was. We'd talk about other things, try to keep it light, but there was no going back. Then, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. We were out with friends, and after a few drinks, I finally asked if we could talk alone. We stepped outside into the chilly night, and I just blurted it out. "What are we doing? Are we really going to pretend nothing happened?" He looked at me, and for a long moment I thought he was going to brush it off, make some joke like he always did. But instead, he sighed and said, "I don't know. I'm terrified of messing this up." We stood there in silence, both of us too afraid to say what we were really feeling. But the way he looked at me, with that same vulnerability I'd seen the night he kissed me, told me everything I needed to know. I took a deep breath, swallowed my fear, and told him the truth. I don't think I can just be friends anymore. I don't think I ever could. It was the hardest thing I'd ever said, and for a second, I thought he'd pull away. But then he reached out, taking my hand, and the look in his eyes was so full of relief that I felt like I could breathe again. He smiled, this small, crooked smile that made me fall for him all over again, and said, "Me neither." From that moment on, things were different. We both agreed to take it slow, not to rush into anything. We spent the next few months figuring out this new version of us, sometimes stumbling, sometimes overthinking, but always coming back to each other. There were moments of doubt, times when we'd worry about what would happen if things didn't work out. But the connection we'd shared for so many years felt even stronger, more real, like we'd finally found what we'd been missing. It wasn't perfect. There were fights, tears, moments when we were both terrified of losing the friendship we'd built. But each time we'd work through it, choosing each other, choosing this strange, wonderful relationship that had somehow always been waiting for us. Today, he's still my best friend, my partner in everything. We still have our silly jokes, our shared memories, the ease of two people who've known each other forever. But now, there's something more, something we don't have to ignore or bury. He's the love of my life, the person I didn't realize I'd been waiting for all along. Every so often, we'll look at each other and laugh, marveling at how it took us so long to figure it out. And maybe we're a little late, but we both know it was worth the wait. Some people spend their whole lives searching for what we found, and I feel lucky every day that I get to be with my best friend, my person. I almost didn't go. It had been one of those soul-draining weeks at work, and the idea of heading out sounded like the last thing I needed. But my friend Sarah was relentless. "Come on, you need this," she'd said, her voice bright with that kind of convincing energy that's hard to argue with. She promised it would be a chill night, just a couple of drinks at a new rooftop bar, nothing crazy. So, reluctantly, I pulled myself together, put on some makeup, and let her drag me into the night. When we got there, the place was already buzzing, the city's lights sparkling like something out of a postcard. I immediately felt that familiar blend of excitement and slight dread that comes with being out when you're not sure you even want to be. I ordered a drink and settled into the evening, half listening to Sarah's stories while scanning the crowd in that absent way, just taking it all in. And that's when I noticed him. He was sitting alone at the end of the bar, nursing a whiskey and staring out over the edge of the rooftop, lost in his own world. Something about him pulled me in, maybe the quiet way he held himself, as if he was as much an observer as I was. Our eyes met, and he offered a small, shy smile, one that I returned without even thinking. Eventually, he came over, introduced himself as Noah, and we started talking, our conversation casual at first, the usual small talk. But there was something about him, a gentleness and an openness, that made it feel easy to talk about more than just the surface-level stuff. He told me he was new to the city, had just moved for work and hadn't quite settled in yet. I found myself sharing more than I usually would, telling him about the places I loved, the little hideaways that made the city feel like home. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and we drifted to a quieter corner of the rooftop, sitting on the edge of a bench under a string of fairy lights that cast a warm glow over everything. We fell into a conversation that felt unfiltered, like we were two people who'd known each other far longer than a couple of hours. He told me about his dreams to travel, his unexpected love for old jazz records, the way he'd once impulsively driven all night to catch a sunrise on the coast just to feel alive. In that moment, something shifted. I felt a thrill, a sort of vulnerability I hadn't allowed myself in a long time. When he reached for my hand, it felt natural, the warmth of his palm grounding me. We both stopped talking, just letting the quiet night and the city lights fill the space between us. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and inevitable, he leaned in, and our lips met in a soft, lingering kiss that left me feeling lightheaded, as if the ground beneath us had shifted. We decided to keep the night going, wandering down the street to a late-night diner, the kind that serves breakfast all day and feels timeless. We laughed over pancakes and coffee, stealing glances like two teenagers, giddy and caught up in the magic of it all. It felt surreal, like a scene out of a movie, the kind you watch and think, people don't really meet like this. But there we were living it. When we left the diner, it was well past midnight, but neither of us was ready to say goodbye. He suggested we go back to his place just to listen to music and keep talking, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no hesitation. His apartment was a bit messy, filled with unpacked boxes and scattered books, but there was a charm to it, a sense of beginning. We spent the rest of the night curled up on his couch, listening to old jazz records and talking in whispers, as though we were the only two people awake in the world. He told me stories that had me laughing until my sides hurt, and in the quiet moments, I found myself lost in the warmth of his gaze, wondering how I'd found myself in such a moment with someone I'd just met. By the time the first light of dawn started creeping through the window, we drifted off to sleep, wrapped up in each other. I woke up before him, watching the morning light fall across his face, and felt a strange mix of happiness and melancholy. I knew this was one of those nights that could either become a beautiful memory or the beginning of something more, but I was afraid to hope too much. When he woke up, he looked at me with a smile that was sleepy and soft, and I felt myself melt a little. We shared coffee, still in our dreamy morning haze, and he walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine as he said goodbye. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but instead he just smiled, and I knew we were both feeling that bittersweet uncertainty. I left his place with my heart full and a quiet sadness lingering at the edges, already aware that this night would live in my mind for a long time. I spent the rest of the day caught between the thrill of it all and the ache of knowing that moments like this are rare, precious, and often fleeting. Over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about that night, replaying the laughter, the comfort, the way he'd listened to me like no one else had in ages. I realized that, as wonderful as the experience was, it had also opened my eyes to something I hadn't fully acknowledged, that I was ready for more. More than just a perfect night. I wanted something lasting, something that could carry me through the mornings and the days beyond. Since then, I've held on to that night with Noah, not just as a memory, but as a reminder of what I'm looking for. I know now that while one magical night can be beautiful, what I truly want is the magic that can stay. And until I find that, I'll keep this memory tucked close, a reminder of what's possible, a glimpse into the kind of connection I know is out there. I was at the dog park with my overexcited golden retriever, Charlie, who was determined to say hello to every single dog in sight. As he dragged me across the park with an enthusiasm only a retriever could muster, I heard a laugh nearby. "You've got your hands full there," said a guy holding the leash of a sleepy-looking bulldog. He had kind eyes and a relaxed smile, and his dog was the complete opposite of Charlie, just lounging at his feet like he couldn't be bothered with the whole park concept. "Tell me about it," I replied, half laughing, half panting as Charlie strained against the leash to greet yet another new friend. "This is his favorite place on earth. I think he'd move in if he could." The guy chuckled, giving his bulldog a pat on the head. "I'm Jake, and this is Oscar," he introduced himself, gesturing down at his very unenthusiastic dog. Oscar doesn't understand the appeal. I practically had to bribe him with treats to get him off the couch. "Nice to meet you. I'm Lily, and this whirlwind is Charlie," I said, trying to reel in my dog, who was now eagerly sniffing Jake's shoe. "Charlie's clearly the life of the party," Jake observed, amused. We started chatting about our dogs' wildly different personalities, swapping stories of their quirks and misadventures. Charlie would pull toward every new person, while Oscar just sat down stubbornly, looking like he wanted nothing more than to go home and nap. As we talked, Jake asked, "So, does Charlie always have this much energy?" I think Oscar could use some pointers. "Oh, absolutely," I replied. "The secret is zero personal boundaries. He'll make friends with a fire hydrant if he has to." Jake laughed, and for a second, we both fell silent, watching as Charlie finally managed to convince Oscar to stand up and sniff around. The two of them started a comically mismatched game of chase, with Charlie bounding excitedly while Oscar waddled behind him at a much slower pace. We couldn't help but laugh at the sight. "You know," Jake said, watching the dogs, "I never thought Oscar would willingly run after another dog. Your pup might have some magic powers. Or maybe Oscar's just being polite," I joked. Charlie doesn't exactly take no for an answer. As the dogs continued their game, I felt this sense of ease between us, like we'd stumbled into something unexpectedly comfortable. We moved to a nearby bench, talking about everything from our jobs to our favorite local hiking spots. Jake worked as a graphic designer, and he shared funny stories about the eccentric clients he'd dealt with. I told him about my own work, which involved rescuing rare plants for a botanical garden, and he listened with genuine interest, even asking about my favorite kinds of plants. After a while, Jake glanced down at his watch, a hint of disappointment in his expression. "It's probably about time for Oscar's post-park nap," he said with a grin. He's got a very strict nap schedule. I think Charlie's finally starting to slow down too, I replied, noticing that he was actually lying down for once, looking surprisingly mellow. Jake hesitated, then looked at me with a hopeful smile. Would you and Charlie maybe want to meet here again sometime? Oscar could use the exercise. And well, I wouldn't mind seeing you again. My heart did a little flip. I'd like that, I said, trying to sound casual as I handed him my phone. He typed in his number and handed it back, his eyes twinkling. Great. I'll bring Oscar, and maybe I'll try bribing him with extra treats. As we said our goodbyes and walked off in opposite directions, I couldn't help but smile. Charlie looked up at me with his tongue hanging out, as if he somehow understood what had just happened. I gave him a pat, feeling like maybe, just maybe, my dog had led me to something special. A few months back, I attended a dinner party hosted by a friend of a friend. You know the type of gathering, where you don't know half the people and spend the first hour standing awkwardly by the snack table, hoping someone strikes up a conversation. I almost didn't go, but something pulled me there that night, as if I'd be missing out on something if I stayed home. The house was beautiful, one of those older Grand Victorian houses that's been renovated but still creaks with history. I was admiring the woodwork in the hallway when a woman approached me. She was in her 50s, maybe early 60s, with short silver hair and eyes that sparkled with this intense, almost mischievous energy. She introduced herself as Iris, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation. There was something magnetic about her, a kind of confidence and ease that made it feel like I'd known her forever. At some point, as we talked about nothing in particular, she looked at me closely and said, "Tell me something true." I laughed, a little thrown off. "What do you mean?" "Tell me something real," she said, her voice lower. "Something that matters to you, but that you don't talk about with just anyone." It felt strange, an invitation from a stranger to be vulnerable. But Iris had this way of looking at me that made me feel safe, like I could tell her anything. So I took a breath and told her about my father, how he passed away when I was 17, and how I sometimes wondered if he'd be proud of who I'd become. It was a thought I rarely admitted out loud, not even to myself. When I finished, Iris was quiet for a moment, her eyes soft and understanding. "I lost my son," she said, almost in a whisper. "He was 19. Sometimes I feel like he's still here, just out of sight, like he's waiting for me in some other room." Her words hit me like a wave, and I could feel the shared ache between us, this invisible thread of loss that only those who've been through it can understand. I hadn't planned on spending the night bearing my soul to a stranger, but something about that moment felt right. Real. As the night wore on, Iris and I drifted between groups, sharing stories and laughing, and I felt a kind of kinship with her that was hard to explain. She was vibrant, full of life, but there was a depth to her that made me feel like I was being seen in a way I hadn't in years. At one point, she pulled a small, silver pendant from around her neck and handed it to me. "This is for you," she said. "Oh no, I couldn't," I started, but she pressed it into my hand firmly. "It's just for a little while," she said, smiling. "When you don't need it anymore, you'll know who to give it to." I didn't fully understand, but I accepted it, feeling the cool weight of it in my palm. The pendant was simple, a small silver circle with an intricate knot in the middle. It felt old, as if it had passed through many hands before mine. The night eventually wound down, and I said goodbye to Iris, feeling an odd sense of gratitude mixed with sadness, like I was parting from an old friend. "Maybe I'll see you again?" I asked, a little more hopeful than I meant to sound. She just smiled, that enigmatic smile of hers. "You never know," she said, and then she was gone, disappearing into the night. The next few weeks passed in a blur, but I found myself thinking about Iris more often than I'd like to admit. There was something about her that lingered, like the scent of her perfume or the warmth of her laugh. I wore the pendant every day, almost without thinking about it. It felt like a connection to her, to that moment of shared vulnerability we'd had at the party. One afternoon, while working at the office, I absent-mindedly ran my thumb over the pendant, and a sudden urge hit me to visit my father's grave. It was something I hadn't done in a long time. I'd always found it too painful, too final. But that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go. The cemetery was quiet, bathed in the soft, late afternoon light. I found his headstone, a simple marker surrounded by fallen leaves, and stood there, feeling the familiar ache rise in my chest. But this time, instead of turning away from it, I stayed, letting the memories wash over me. I spoke to him, as if he were standing right there beside me, telling him about the person I'd become, about the fears and doubts I carried. It felt strange, but freeing, like I was letting go of something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding on to. As I stood there, the pendant warm in my hand, I suddenly felt this quiet peace settle over me, like a weight lifting. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if I'd been given permission to move forward, to stop questioning if I was doing enough to honor him. I knew then that he'd want me to live, to be happy. On the way back, I felt lighter, as if a piece of me had been put back together. When I got home, I took off the pendant for the first time since Iris had given it to me. I realized then that I was ready to pass it on. Not long after, I met a young woman at a community event. She was quiet, reserved, with this deep sadness in her eyes that reminded me of myself. We got to talking, and as we walked outside together afterward, she opened up to me about her brother, who had passed away suddenly. She told me about the weight she carried, the guilt and confusion she felt, and I could see how fresh her pain was, like an open wound. I knew what I had to do. I reached into my pocket and handed her the pendant, watching as her fingers traced its shape, much as mine had. "This is for you," I said softly. "Someone gave it to me when I needed it, and now it's yours until you don't need it anymore." She looked at me, her eyes wide with gratitude, and in that moment, I felt Iris's presence beside me, as if she were nodding in approval, her quiet smile lingering in the air. Since then, I haven't seen Iris again, but I believe she's still out there, passing through lives, leaving pieces of herself in people who need them. I think of her whenever I see someone carrying a quiet sadness or a hidden weight, and I hope that in some way, she's still offering her kindness, her warmth, to those who find themselves lost. And I like to think that one day, when I need it most, that pendant might find its way back to me, a reminder that we're never truly alone, that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, we find exactly what we need in the people who walk beside us, if only for a little while. All right, this one's about my friend Marcus, who had what he calls the most ridiculous night of his life while working as an emergency plumber. Marcus was used to handling late-night calls, usually fixing burst pipes or unclogging stubborn drains. But one night, he got a call from a frantic client that made everything else seem routine. It was around midnight when his phone rang, and the dispatcher explained that there was a water issue at a big, upscale house in the suburbs. The client wouldn't explain the problem over the phone, but kept repeating, "Get someone here now." Marcus sighed, figuring it was just another flooded basement, and drove out there. When he arrived, a very nervous man answered the door, practically dragging Marcus inside without even saying hello. He led him to the bathroom, where Marcus saw something he'd never expect to encounter: a massive aquarium. A tank big enough to belong in a public aquarium, not someone's bathroom, was leaking water all over the marble floor. Inside the tank, a large, annoyed-looking octopus was suctioned to the glass, glaring at them as if this whole situation was somehow their fault. The man, pacing in sheer panic, explained that the octopus, a rare and extremely valuable specimen named Otto, had gotten bored and decided to mess with the tank's filtration system, loosening a valve and causing water to pour out onto the floor. Marcus was stunned. He'd expected a leaky faucet, maybe a clogged toilet. Instead, he was dealing with a rogue octopus on a midnight mission of destruction. Without hesitation, Marcus got to work. He tried to fix the valve from outside the tank, but Otto had other ideas. The octopus kept reaching out to tug on Marcus's tools, almost as if it was trying to help. At one point, Otto grabbed onto Marcus's wrench and refused to let go, turning what should have been a quick fix into an underwater tug-of-war. Marcus could swear the octopus was playing with him, using those beady little eyes to assess his every move and reacting with what seemed like genuine mischief. Finally, Marcus told the owner they'd need to drain some of the water to relieve the pressure. The owner paled, horrified by the thought of upsetting his beloved Otto, but he reluctantly agreed. As Marcus began siphoning out some water, Otto started flailing around dramatically, splashing water everywhere, as if he were throwing a tantrum. The owner whispered, "He's never done this before," as though Otto's antics were somehow Marcus's fault. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus managed to fix the valve and stop the leak. Otto, apparently satisfied that his point had been made, released the wrench and settled back against the glass, watching Marcus with a smug, almost victorious look. The owner thanked Marcus profusely, offering him a massive tip for his trouble. But Marcus was too exhausted to feel anything but relief. As he was leaving, the owner added, almost as an afterthought, "By the way, if you're ever free for a side job, I could use someone who understands Otto's special needs." Marcus just shook his head, politely declined, and drove off into the night, promising himself he'd stick to clogged drains from then on. Now, whenever someone mentions having a pet problem, Marcus tells them, "Unless you're wrestling an octopus at 2 a.m., trust me, it's manageable." It was supposed to be a quiet night in. I told myself I'd take it easy, order some takeout, and catch up on a new series. But then my best friend Maya called, practically begging me to come out to a party across town. She insisted it was going to be a night to remember, and that I absolutely had to be there. After a few minutes of playful guilt-tripping, she had me reluctantly agreeing, tossing on an outfit, and heading out the door with a mix of excitement and a slight feeling of regret that I'd traded in my cozy night. The party was in full swing when I arrived, a house packed with music blaring, laughter spilling out of every room, and the kind of energy that makes you feel alive even before you've had a drink. Maya greeted me with a loud cheer, shoving a drink in my hand and immediately dragging me into the mix. For a while, it was fun but chaotic, people weaving in and out, conversations overlapping, and I felt myself getting swept up in the buzz. And then I saw him. He was leaning against the wall near the kitchen, watching the party with an amused look, as though he were enjoying it from the outside. He had this easy confidence, the kind that's noticeable even from across the room. When his eyes met mine, he gave a small, knowing smile, and just like that, the crowd faded into the background. I don't remember how we ended up next to each other, but the conversation felt like it had a life of its own. His name was Eli, and he had this quick wit and a way of making even the simplest topics feel interesting. We skipped the small talk almost immediately, diving into the kind of conversation that felt deep, yet effortless, like we were picking up where we'd left off in some other life. It was strange how natural it felt to talk to him, how easily he made me laugh, and I found myself wondering how I'd never met someone like him before. After a while, the noise of the party became overwhelming, and he asked if I wanted to step outside. We slipped out onto the patio, where the air was cool and the city lights blinked in the distance. It was quieter, almost serene compared to the chaos inside, and I felt my shoulders relax. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the lights, and in the soft glow, I could see a gentleness in his eyes, something that made me feel like I could trust him without even knowing why. We talked about the most random things, favorite places we'd traveled, books we'd read, dreams we hadn't told anyone about. There was a vulnerability to it, a feeling of peeling back layers without fear of judgment. I don't know what it was, but something in that quiet conversation felt rare, precious, like we'd stumbled into a bubble that only we could see. At some point, he reached out and took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a gentle, almost hesitant way. My heart was racing, but I felt a calm settle over me, like this moment was exactly where I was supposed to be. When he leaned in to kiss me, it was soft, unhurried, a question more than an answer, and I felt myself melt into it, letting the world fall away around us. We didn't go back inside after that. Instead, he suggested we go for a walk, and before I knew it, we were wandering through quiet streets, our hands entwined, talking in whispers as if not to disturb the magic of the night. It felt like we were the only two people awake in the world, drifting through a city that seemed transformed in the darkness. Eventually, we ended up at a small park, sitting on a bench under the stars, the silence between us comfortable and full of something unspoken. We didn't need to fill the space with words. Just being there, side by side, felt enough. He told me stories about his childhood, dreams he'd chased and let go of, and I felt a pang of recognition, like he was mirroring pieces of myself back to me. When he finally walked me home, The city was quiet, bathed in the first hints of dawn. We stood outside my door, both lingering, reluctant to end the night. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, and gave me a soft smile that felt like a secret, a promise neither of us needed to put into words. I didn't want to break the spell, but reality was already creeping in, and I knew this was goodbye. As I slipped inside, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and sadness, like I'd been given a glimpse of something beautiful that I couldn't quite hold on to. I lay awake for hours, replaying the night in my mind, feeling the warmth of his hand, the softness of his kiss, the way he'd looked at me like he'd known me forever. The next day, the memory of that night felt almost like a dream, something hazy and magical that was already slipping away. But the feeling stayed, a quiet reminder of the connection we'd shared, the ease, the laughter, the sense that we'd both stepped into each other's lives, if only for a moment. I knew that night with Eli was something rare, a kind of magic that can't be manufactured or forced, only stumbled upon. And while part of me wished I could see him again, another part understood that maybe this was exactly how it was meant to be, perfect, fleeting, something to be treasured rather than held on to. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to that memory often, savoring the way he'd made me feel, the way he'd shown me a part of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. It reminded me that there are connections out there waiting to be discovered, that sometimes the most beautiful experiences aren't meant to last, but to remind us of what's possible. So, I carry that night with me, a little piece of wonder tucked into the corners of my mind, a memory of Eli and the magic we shared under the city lights. And every time I think of him, I smile, grateful for that one perfect night when everything felt like it was exactly as it should be, if only for a few hours. I met Dylan on a dating app during one of those optimistic phases when I thought, maybe this time I'll meet someone normal. His profile was unpretentious. He looked like a regular outdoorsy guy with a goofy smile, and we exchanged a few genuinely funny messages. He worked as an architect, loved cooking, and mentioned he was a huge dog person, which instantly won points with me. After a week of chatting, he asked if I'd like to meet up at a small Thai place in town, and I said yes, feeling that hopeful spark I hadn't felt in ages. I showed up a little early, snagged a table by the window, and was just scrolling through my phone when I saw him walk in. He was just as cute in person, maybe even a little taller than I'd expected. We hugged, ordered drinks, and immediately launched into an easy, flowing conversation. He told me about his job, a recent hiking trip, his disastrous attempt at learning to surf. It all felt refreshingly real. Halfway through the meal, he started asking about my hobbies, and I mentioned that I loved reading, especially thrillers and mystery novels. His face lit up, and he said, "No way. I love reading too, but I'm more into, well, different kinds of stuff." Intrigued, I asked him what he meant. He hesitated, gave me a slightly nervous smile, and said, "Okay, don't laugh, but I'm really into personal growth books." I was relieved. If this was the weird thing about him, I could handle it. But he didn't stop there. Like specifically manifesting, he said, his eyes brightening. You know, the law of attraction, creating your own reality, that kind of stuff. I tried to nod politely, hoping he'd just move on. But he was already reaching into his bag, pulling out a well-worn book with a neon pink cover titled, "Manifest Your Inner Power." He set it on the table between us like it was a prized artifact. "This book changed my life," he said, tapping the cover with reverence. "I read it every morning. It's part of my routine." He then went on to describe his morning manifestation ritual in meticulous detail. Every day, he would visualize his goals, health, wealth, even the exact type of future partner he wanted. I tried to look impressed, but my mind was racing, thinking, is this guy for real? "Have you ever manifested anything?" he asked, as if it were the most normal question in the world. I laughed awkwardly and said, not really." He gave me a sympathetic smile, like I was some poor soul unaware of the true secrets of the universe. "You should try it," he said eagerly. "It's life-changing. You'd be surprised how powerful your energy is." Trying to change the subject, I asked if he'd traveled anywhere recently, thinking that would lead us to safer territory. But he somehow managed to steer that question right back to manifesting. He launched into an elaborate story about his recent trip to Sedona, where he'd gone to realign his energy at some vortex sites. He went on about the energy points in Sedona, explaining how he'd sat in meditation for hours, absorbing the vibrations of the earth. He even had a few rocks in his bag that he'd collected from the site, which he claimed were charged with pure cosmic energy. At this point, I was struggling to keep a straight face, nodding along as he recounted a story about meeting a shaman who told him he was destined for greatness. The shaman could just sense my aura, he said, his eyes gleaming. It was incredible. She said I have the spirit of a wolf. I bit my lip, trying so hard not to burst out laughing, picturing this guy with his wolf spirit rocks and neon manifesting book. But the night took an even stranger turn when the food arrived. As I started to dig into my pad thai, he paused, staring down at his plate with a serious expression. He took a deep breath, then pressed his hands together and closed his eyes. I need to express gratitude to the universe, he whispered, and before I knew it, he was giving a full-on, whispered prayer of thanks to the universe and the farmers who harvested the rice, finishing with a heartfelt, and to all the positive energies that brought us together tonight. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to join in. I managed a week, thank you, Rice, and quickly took a bite to avoid laughing in his face. He seemed pleased, like I'd just joined some cosmic club, and went on about the importance of gratitude and mindfulness. At this point, I was counting down the minutes, praying the check would arrive soon. Finally, dessert came, and I thought we were in the clear. But Dylan had one last trick up his sleeve. He leaned in close, giving me this intense stare. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. I nodded, wary but curious. "Do you believe in past lives?" I tried to dodge the question, but he took my silence as an invitation. He explained that he'd been working with a spiritual guide to uncover his own past lives and believed he'd been a Viking warrior in a previous existence. "I think I was a healer too," he said almost dreamily. "Sometimes when I touch people, they tell me they feel lighter, like I'm taking away their pain." He reached across the table and gently placed his hand on mine. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his face utterly sincere. I stared at him, speechless, feeling less healed and more like I'd fallen into some surreal spiritual parody. I managed to pull my hand away politely, mumbling something about it being interesting. He nodded sagely, clearly convinced he'd just performed some kind of metaphysical miracle. Finally, the check came, and he insisted on paying. "Money is energy," he explained, smiling as he handed over cash. "What you give, you get back." As we walked out, he looked up at the stars, then back at me. "Tonight was really special. I could feel the energy flowing between us," he said earnestly. "I'm so glad the universe brought us together." I gave him a tight-lipped smile, muttering something about how nice it was to meet him, while backing toward my car as fast as I could without actually sprinting. When I got home, I saw he'd already sent me a text. "Thank you for sharing your energy with me tonight, Sparkles Milky Way. I feel like our souls have met before. Let's reconnect soon." I didn't reply. For the next few days, I kept replaying the night in my head, a strange mix of fascination and horror. My friends got endless laughs out of manifesting Dylan, and it became a running joke every time one of us went on a date. "Don't forget to charge your rocks," they'd joke, or "Did you thank the rice?" In the end, Dylan taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, even the nicest, most normal-looking people can surprise you in the strangest ways. And maybe, just maybe, I'd leave the manifesting and spiritual journeys to the experts, or at least to people who didn't think they were secret Viking healers. We met in middle school, two awkward kids who bonded over a shared hatred for gym class and a love of comic books. He was my safe place, the person I could vent to about my weird family, my relentless insecurity, my secret dreams. By the time we reached high school, he'd practically become part of my family, always around for movie nights, family barbecues, and countless long drives with no destination in mind. We laughed at the idea of us ever being together. People joked about it constantly, but we both swore it would never happen. We were too close, too much like family. When college came around, we drifted. I went to a university across the country, and he stayed local, both of us thrown into new lives and new friendships. But every holiday, every summer break, we'd pick right back up as if nothing had changed. It was almost like a secret pact. We could go anywhere, do anything, and we'd still be each other's person. After graduation, life moved even faster. I got a demanding job in the city, and he started a business with his brother. We'd go months without talking, and although it hurt a little, I accepted that it was just part of growing up. Until last year, when I moved back to our hometown. It felt like a homecoming in every sense, and before I even unpacked, he showed up at my door, grinning like he'd never left. Within days, we were back to our old routines, late-night takeout, rewatching our favorite shows, him trying to make me laugh until I couldn't breathe. One Friday, we decided to go to a concert for a band we'd loved since high school. Halfway through, the band played a song we used to obsess over, and he grabbed my hand, pulling me closer as we sang at the top of our lungs. It was so effortless, so perfect, that I didn't even realize we were still holding hands until the concert ended. He looked down at our entwined fingers, then back at me, his smile fading into something softer, something that sent my heart racing. I pulled my hand back, laughing it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. The next few weeks were filled with moments like that, small, lingering glances, touches that felt heavier, laughter that felt warmer. And all the while, I was fighting this feeling that I didn't even want to name. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being dramatic. But one night, he invited me over for dinner, and when I walked into his apartment, something about the way he looked at me made me realize that maybe he'd been feeling the same way. We spent the night talking, sharing stories we'd somehow never told each other, laughing about old memories. When it was time to leave, I stood at the door, suddenly aware of how close we were standing. He looked at me with this expression I couldn't read, and before I knew what I was doing, I leaned in and kissed him. It was soft, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters of something that had always been there. He kissed me back, and it felt like the whole world shifted. The next morning, everything felt strange but exhilarating. We tiptoed around the subject, both of us too scared to ask what it meant. Over breakfast, he finally cleared his throat and said, "So last night." I laughed nervously, unable to meet his eyes. "Yeah," I mumbled, waiting for him to say something, anything that would make sense of the whirlwind in my head. He reached across the table, taking my hand, and said, "I think we've been avoiding this for a long time." I looked up, surprised, and felt this overwhelming sense of relief, of happiness, of something I couldn't even name. We decided to see where things went, both of us promising not to ruin the friendship that had kept us together all these years. It was amazing and terrifying, stumbling into this new part of our relationship, realizing that I'd loved him for a long time without even knowing it. We'd have nights where we'd laugh about how we'd missed it, and other nights where we'd just hold each other, both of us afraid of messing up the one thing that mattered most. But there were bumps. Some days we'd fall into our old friendship patterns, and other days I'd feel insecure, wondering if he really felt the same way or if I was just imagining it. One night, after a particularly bad argument about something trivial, he pulled me into his arms and said, "Look, I know this is hard, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That was all I needed to hear. Months went by, and our relationship grew deeper, stronger. It wasn't always easy. There were times when we'd get caught up in our fears, times when we'd question if we were doing the right thing. But we kept choosing each other, kept coming back to the friendship that had brought us together in the first place. Today, he's not just my best friend. He's my partner in every sense of the word. We still have our silly jokes, our ridiculous inside references that no one else understands. But now, there's something more, something that feels unbreakable. I never thought I'd fall in love with my best friend, but now, I can't imagine it any other way. He's the person who knows me better than anyone else, the person I want beside me through every high and low, every dream and disappointment. Every so often, I'll catch him looking at me with that soft, familiar smile, and I'll remember all the years we spent as just friends. And I feel incredibly lucky knowing that sometimes the love of your life is hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to open your eyes and see what's been there all along. The night I got the text from my brother, I was already half asleep, the light from my phone casting a pale glow in the dark room. "If you're up for it, We need you out here. That was it. No gritin, no explanación. But I knew what it meant. I hadn't been home in years. Not since the family had started falling apart, piece by piece. My parents' divorce had fractured everything, sending my dad to the other side of the country and my mom into herself. My younger brother, Andy, was left in the wreckage, keeping the house together in the way that kids shouldn't have to. I'd escaped the first chance I got, heading off to college and then staying out west, telling myself it was easier to be a phone call away. I replied, asking him what was going on. The answer came quick. Mom's having a hard time. It's getting bad. I booked a flight that night, arriving back in town 2 days later. The winter air felt sharper here, slicing right through my coat as I stood outside the airport, waiting for Andy to pick me up. When he pulled up in his old, beat-up truck, I barely recognized him. He'd grown taller, his face sharper, like the years had carved something new into him. But when he saw me, he grinned, that same crooked smile that made him look like the kid I remembered. "Welcome home," he said as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Thanks. Been a while." I replied, feeling a rush of memories I'd kept buried for too long. The drive was quiet, the familiar roads winding through town, each corner pulling at memories of late-night drives, high school hangouts, and all the places I thought I'd left behind. We passed by the old school, the diner we'd go to on weekends, the field where we used to play soccer with kids from the neighborhood. It was all the same, and yet it felt like a different world. "So, what's going on with Mom?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. And he kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. "It's worse than before. She's distant, more than usual. Doesn't talk much, just spends her time wandering around the house, looking at old photo albums. It's like she's somewhere else." I nodded, my chest tightening. I'd always known that leaving her after the divorce hadn't been the best choice, but I'd thought she'd eventually be okay, that time would heal whatever was broken. But hearing Andy talk about her like this made me feel a gnawing guilt I hadn't let myself feel in years. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, its paint chipping, the windows dark. Inside, the place was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that settles when people have stopped talking to each other. I found Mom in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug of tea, staring out the window at nothing. She looked up as we walked in, her face lighting up with a faint smile. "You made it," she said, her voice soft. "Yeah, I did," I replied, taking a seat across from her. For a long moment, we just sat there, the years stretching between us like a river we didn't know how to cross. She looked so different, her hair streaked with gray, lines around her eyes I didn't remember. But her smile was the same, that warm, familiar smile that made her feel like home. After a while, she reached over, her hand covering mine. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, feeling the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. "Of course, Mom." The next few days were a slow rhythm of quiet moments, each one peeling back layers I hadn't realized were there. I helped her with small things, washing dishes, tidying up, taking out the trash, tasks that seemed too small to matter, but somehow felt like they were bridging the distance between us. One afternoon, as I was going through a box of old photos, she came into the room, her eyes soft and distant. She took a seat beside me, picking up a picture of the four of us, back when my parents were still together. In the photo, we were all laughing, caught in some moment I could barely remember. "Those were good times," she murmured, her voice tinged with a sadness that felt like a weight pressing on my chest. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They were." She looked at me, her gaze searching, and for a moment, it felt like she was seeing me for the first time in years. "I know I wasn't the best mother after everything happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to keep things together. I thought you'd all be better off without me dragging you down." "Mom," I said, my throat tight, "we needed you. Andy still needs you. And so do I." She nodded, tears filling her eyes, and I felt a sudden surge of anger at myself, at all the years I'd spent running from her, from everything. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," I whispered. I don't know what I thought." She reached out, her hand trembling, and pulled me into a hug. For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of her arms around me, the kind of hug I'd missed more than I'd let myself admit. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the years fall away, letting the hurt fade, if only for a moment. That night, after she went to bed, Andy and I sat on the back porch, watching the stars flicker in the clear winter sky. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a thoughtful look on his face. "Think she'll be okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. I sighed, looking up at the stars, feeling the weight of everything settling over me. "I think she'll be okay if we're here for her." He nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "Guess that means you'll be sticking around?" I smiled, the thought of staying both terrifying and comforting. "Yeah, I think so. At least for a while." We sat there in silence, side by side, the cold air biting at our faces, but somehow I felt warmer than I had in years. There was a peace in that moment, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, things could start to heal. In the days that followed, we slipped into a gentle rhythm, a new normal that felt fragile, but real. I stayed longer than I'd planned, taking small steps to rebuild the bonds I'd let fray over the years. Mom started to smile more, her laughter filling the house again, faint but steady, like an old song you'd forgotten you loved. The night before I left, Mom and I sat in the living room, going through more photos, each one a memory we'd tucked away. She looked over at me, her eyes bright, a softness in her expression I hadn't seen in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "for coming home." I squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth settle in my chest. "Thank you for letting me." When I finally drove away, watching the house disappear in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange sense of peace, like a part of me was still there, woven into the walls, the memories, the love we'd rebuilt. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole.